Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. There is a scene tucked into the 9th book of the oldest war poem the Western world possesses that gets skipped past far too quickly by most people who think they already know this story, and it is worth sitting with it slowly tonight, because it is stranger than it looks. 3 men walk along a dark beach, past the black hulls of 1,000 ships, past the watchfires of an army that has been camped on this same stretch of foreign sand for 9 years, and they are carrying between them an offer so enormous that no soldier in that entire army, hearing the terms repeated the next morning, would have believed any sane man could turn it down. 7 tripods of pure unworked bronze, 10 talents of gold, a fortune by itself, 20 gleaming cauldrons, 12 racehorses that had won prizes in their own right, 7 skilled women taken from a captured city. The return, unransomed and unransomed for, of a woman already once taken from him. A promise of treasure beyond counting once the war was finally won. And, more than any of it, the hand of a king's own daughter in marriage, with a dowry of 7 entire cities thrown in alongside her. An offer that would have made an ordinary man in a single evening wealthier and more secure than his own father had ever been. The 3 envoys reach the tent of the one man this offer is actually meant for, and they find him sitting quietly with a lyre in his hands, singing to himself of the deeds of heroes who came before him, and he rises and welcomes them warmly, and orders wine mixed and meat roasted with his own hands, because whatever fury is boiling in him has nothing to do with these particular men. And then he listens to the whole offer, all of it, laid out in careful and respectful detail, and when it is finished he says no. That refusal is the subject of tonight's story, and I want to be honest with you, here at the very start, about what kind of story this is actually going to be, because it is not going to be the story you may already know, or that this channel has already told in full on another night in this room. The long, complete tale of Achilles, his birth and his choice and his rage and his grief and his own death, waiting for you elsewhere, if that is the story you're looking for tonight. Tonight is narrower and stranger and in some ways harder, because tonight we're going to take one single decision made by one man over the course of perhaps an hour in a tent on a beach nearly 3,000 years ago, and we're going to turn it over and over in the dark, the way you might turn over a stone you found on a beach yourself, looking at every face of it, until we actually understand why a man who wanted, by his own account, nothing more than to be honoured for what he had already given, chose to answer the single richest bribe in the whole of ancient literature with a flat and unbending no. Because the reflex answer, the answer most retellings settle for, is that Achilles was proud, or sulking, or nursing a grudge over a woman who had been taken from him, and that answer is not wrong so much as it is desperately incomplete, a child's version of a decision that turns out, the closer you look at it, to be one of the most serious pieces of moral reasoning that has survived from the ancient world. A decision that asks, underneath all its wounded pride, a question that has never actually gone away. What, precisely, is a human life worth, and can any system of honour or wealth or glory ever actually pay that price in full? Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so that you carry the shape of tonight's argument with you through everything still to come. Achilles did not refuse to fight because a woman had been taken from him, though a woman had been taken from him, and that theft matters, and we will not minimise it tonight. He refused because the theft exposed, in a single public and humiliating stroke, that the entire economy of honour he had staked his own short, deliberately chosen life on was capable of being violated by the very man who was supposed to be its guarantor. And once that economy had been shown to be untrustworthy, no gift, however large, could actually repair it, because the gifts were denominated in the same broken currency as the original insult. This is a story, in other words, about the difference between a price and a value, a distinction the ancient world did not have a name for in quite the way we might reach for one tonight, but that Achilles, sitting in his own tent with a lyre still warm in his hands, worked out for himself, in real time, in front of 3 of the most respected men in the entire Greek army, and articulated with a clarity that philosophers would spend the following 2,500 years trying to catch up to. He was being offered, that night, an almost unimaginable price. What he had lost could not be priced at all, and the gap between those two things, the price on offer and the value actually at stake, is where tonight's whole story is going to live. Before we go any further into that gap, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find something worthwhile in what I do here. This channel is still a small one, and if you would like to help it reach 1,000 subscribers, which would mean more to me than I can easily put into words, the simplest way to do that is just to subscribe and to tell one other restless, sleepless person about this quiet corner of the internet if you think they might like it too. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments, because it helps other people out there in the dark find their way here. And there is something genuinely comforting about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same night sky, listening to the same slow, unhurried story. If you enjoy these episodes and would like to hear new ones before they arrive here on YouTube, I have also started posting them early over on Spotify, ahead of their release on this channel, and the link to that is sitting in the description below this video if you would like to follow along there as well. So get comfortable now, let your shoulders sink into whatever you're lying on, and let yourself ease into tonight's slow, careful unravelling of one of the strangest and most consequential refusals in the whole of ancient storytelling. Why this particular quarrel, out of an entire war's worth of quarrels, became the one worth building a whole epic around? It is worth pausing before we take apart the honour economy that governed this whole crisis on a question of pure literary choice, because the poet composing this epic had, in principle, an entire 10-year war's worth of material to choose from as the organising centre of his poem. Raids and duels and disasters spread across an entire decade of fighting, and chose, out of all of it, to build the whole towering structure of the Iliad around this one specific quarrel in the war's final year, rather than around any of the more conventionally dramatic material a lesser poet might have reached for instead: the initial gathering of the fleet, the first landing on the Trojan shore, the eventual fall of the city itself. It is worth asking what this choice tells us, because it is not an obvious or an inevitable one, and the poet's decision to centre an entire epic not on a battle, not on a victory, not even on the war's actual conclusion, but on an argument over a woman's disposition and its long, grinding psychological aftermath, was a genuinely bold act of artistic judgment. It is worth pausing on what that judgment actually reveals about what the poet understood the deepest subject of this whole tradition to actually be. A poet interested primarily in glorifying military conquest would have had every reason to centre his epic on the fall of Troy itself. The wooden horse, the burning city, the triumphant Greek return, material considerably more suited to straightforward celebration of martial victory than a bitter internal quarrel that very nearly cost the Greek army the entire war. That the poet chose otherwise, building the whole architecture of his epic around a crisis of trust and value between two men on the same side, suggests that the tradition understood, at some deep and evidently quite early level of its own composition, that the true subject worth a truly great poem's sustained attention was never really the war against Troy at all. It was this considerably harder and considerably more universal question: what a human life is actually worth, and what happens when the systems meant to honour that worth prove themselves, under pressure, unreliable, a question that a poem about a triumphant siege and a burning city could touch on only glancingly. but that a poem built around one man's furious, unresolved refusal could sit inside for its entire length. It is worth carrying this observation into the very last minutes of tonight's story, because it means everything we have spent this whole evening examining was never a digression from what this poem is actually about. It was the poem's own chosen centre, the specific crisis its own original composer judged worthy of carrying the weight of the single most influential poem the Western literary tradition has ever produced, and it is worth sitting with that choice one final time, because it tells us, more clearly than any amount of modern analysis could add on its own, that the question of why Achilles refused to fight was never a minor footnote to a larger war story. It was, from the very first word the poet ever sang, the whole point, a quarrel that looks, from a distance, absurdly small. Here is the first honest thing that has to be said about this whole affair, and it is a thing that trips up almost everyone who comes to this story for the first time. Because if you strip the quarrel between Achilles and his commander Agamemnon down to its bare material facts, the way a modern court might strip a contract dispute down to its bare material facts, it looks, frankly, almost too small to have caused what it caused. A captive woman, already promised generous compensation once she was handed over, was reassigned from one wealthy warrior's tent to another wealthy warrior's tent. That is, in the coldest possible accounting, the entire material transaction at the centre of a quarrel that nearly saw one Greek commander run through with a sword by his own greatest fighter, that then saw that same fighter withdraw an entire elite contingent of soldiers from a war his own side was losing, that then saw thousands of his own countrymen die in the fighting that followed, and that finally, in the long chain of consequence this whole story sets in motion, cost the life of the one person in the entire war Achilles actually loved without reservation. A transaction that, on paper, involved one woman moving from one tent to another produced, by the time its consequences had finished working themselves out, a body count that any honest historian would have to call catastrophic, and it is worth sitting with that disproportion for a long moment before we go any further tonight, because the disproportion itself is the whole puzzle. Small causes are not supposed to produce catastrophic effects, at least not in the tidy moral universe most of us would prefer to live in, and when they do, our instinct is almost always to look for a hidden, larger cause underneath the small visible one, the way a geologist looks for the deep fault line underneath a surface tremor that seems, on its own, too small to have shaken an entire city. That is exactly the work tonight's story has to do, because the fault line underneath this particular tremor was not, in the end, about Briseis at all, however much both men insisted, in the heat of the argument, that it was. It was about a structure of meaning, an entire way of organising a human life around the pursuit of honour, that the whole society gathered on that beach had built its collective existence upon, warriors and kings and common soldiers alike. And that structure we're going to spend the first stretch of tonight's story taking apart piece by piece, the way you might take apart an old engine on a workbench, laying each part out in the light so you can actually see how it was built to run, before we can understand why a single grain of sand thrown into it was enough to seize the whole mechanism and very nearly wreck the entire expedition. Because here is the thing that a purely narrative retelling of this story, the kind that simply follows the plot from the quarrel to the embassy to the refusal, tends to rush past without quite stopping to explain. The ancient Greek warrior aristocracy that produced this whole epic tradition did not think about honour the way most of us, living in a world of contracts and courts and formal law, are inclined to think about it. For them, honour was not a feeling. It was closer to a form of property, a form of currency, and in some very real sense the only currency that actually mattered, and until we understand that currency on its own terms, Achilles' refusal is always going to look, to modern eyes, like an overreaction to a relatively minor slight. It was not an overreaction. It was, by the internal logic of the world he lived in, the only rational response available to him. And tonight we are going to build that logic up from the ground, so that by the time we reach the tent on the beach again, his no will not sound petulant at all. It will sound, I think, close to inevitable. It is worth pausing one final time before we build this system up properly, on why a modern listener's first instinct, hearing all of this laid out, might still be to ask why any of it should have mattered so much. Why a man could not simply have decided privately that his own worth did not actually depend on what any other man, however powerful, chose to grant him. It is a fair question, and it is worth answering honestly rather than brushing past it, because the honest answer is that this option, the modern, individualist option, of simply deciding inwardly and independently that one's own sense of worth need not depend on external recognition at all, was not really available to a person living inside the specific world. This poem describes a world with no developed philosophical tradition of interior self-sufficiency yet available to draw on. No Stoic teaching about indifference to external fortune. No religious framework promising a worth measured by some authority standing entirely outside the visible community of one's own peers. Those resources, the ones a modern person facing an analogous humiliation might actually reach for, simply had not yet been invented, and it is worth carrying that absence with us as we build the rest of tonight's argument, because it means Achilles was never choosing foolishly to care more than he needed to about a violation he could easily have shrugged off. He was operating inside the only framework of meaning his entire world had yet made available to him, and it is worth extending him the same patience we would want extended to our own choices, made, as everyone's choices are, inside whatever framework of meaning happened to be available at the time. The currency of a warrior's whole existence. To understand what time actually meant in this world, and I'm going to use that word, the old Greek word for honour, deliberately and repeatedly tonight, because our own English word carries connotations that will lead us astray if we're not careful with it. We have to start with a fact about the society gathered on that beach outside Troy that is easy to state and hard to actually feel the weight of. It had no reliable machinery of law standing over it. There was no court a wronged man could appeal to that stood above the men doing the wronging. There was no police force, no independent judiciary, no written code of statutes that a king himself was bound to obey on pain of removal from office. What there was instead was a rough and constantly renegotiated hierarchy of standing among a company of proud, heavily armed men. A hierarchy that was established and re-established, moment by moment, battle by battle, through the visible public recognition of who had done what, who had killed whom, who had captured what, and who, as a direct and immediate consequence, deserved what share of whatever the army as a whole had won. In a world without courts, honour performed the function that courts perform in a world with them. It was the mechanism by which a man's actual worth, and by extension his actual safety, his actual authority, his actual claim on the loyalty of other men, got measured, recorded, and enforced. This is why the old poem is so relentlessly, almost obsessively precise about who receives which specific prize, after which specific victory, a level of bookkeeping that can feel to a modern reader skimming past it like tedious inventory, but that the original audience would have understood immediately as something closer to a running ledger of the only kind of wealth that actually counted in that world, a ledger every man in the army could read at a glance, because every man in the army had watched the distribution happen with his own eyes. It is worth pausing on the specific word the poem uses for a warrior's individual prize, gerus, because the word itself tells you something the English translation loses almost entirely. A gerus was not simply property in the sense that a purchased object is property. It was allocated prize of honour, a physical, visible token distributed by the whole assembled army, or by its acknowledged leader acting on the army's behalf, in direct and calculated proportion to a specific man's contribution to a specific collective victory. This matters enormously, because it means Ageras was never, even for a moment, a purely private transaction between two individuals. It was a public act of recognition, performed in front of witnesses, that translated a man's actual deeds into a physical, ongoing, visible sign of his own worth relative to every other man standing in that same assembly, and once that sign had been granted, it functioned less like a possession and more like a credential, a walking proof carried in his own tent and displayed to any visitor that this particular man had done what the whole army had agreed he had done. To take a man's gerus away, then, was never simply to deprive him of an object. It was to formally, publicly, and irreversibly revise the army's own collective judgment of his worth, downward, in front of every witness who had originally watched that judgment get made. And it is worth letting that sink in for a moment, because once you see it this way, the whole quarrel that opens the Iliad stops looking like two men fighting over a woman and starts looking like something closer to a public demotion, carried out in front of the entire chain of command of the single most valuable soldier in the entire army. It is worth pausing too on what the world outside the poem itself can tell us about how real this whole economy of prizes and public recognition actually was, because this is not simply a literary invention dreamed up by a poet for narrative convenience. Archaeologists working through the ruins of the great Mycenaean palace complexes that once dominated the Greek mainland in the centuries before this poem's own setting have recovered thousands of small clay tablets, baked hard and preserved only by the accidental fires that destroyed the very palaces that produced them, inscribed with a script called Linear B, and those tablets, once painstakingly deciphered in the middle of the 20th century, turned out to record in obsessive and exhaustive detail exactly the kind of careful bureaucratic bookkeeping this whole honour economy would have required to function. Palace scribes tracking flocks of sheep by the hundred, allocations of wool and olive oil and bronze to specific named individuals, ration lists, inventories, records of who received what and in what quantity from the palace's own central stores. These were not poetic inventions. They were the actual administrative backbone of a real, historical Bronze Age society, genuinely organised around the careful tracking and public allocation of material goods as markers of rank and service. And it is worth holding this evidence alongside the poem's own elaborate bookkeeping of tripods and cauldrons and captive women, because it tells us that the poet composing these lines, centuries after the actual Bronze Age palaces themselves had already crumbled into ruin, was drawing on a genuine cultural memory of a real society in which exactly this kind of formal, recorded, publicly witnessed allocation of goods really had once been the primary mechanism through which a man's standing was measured and confirmed. It is worth pausing, too, on what happened to that same society in the centuries between the world the tablets describe and the world the poem was actually composed in, because the Mycenaean palaces themselves collapsed, catastrophically and almost completely, in a series of destructions that swept across the Greek mainland toward the very end of the Bronze Age, ushering in several centuries of a genuine Dark Age, a period so thoroughly stripped of writing, of large-scale building, and of the elaborate bureaucratic administration the tablets record, that later Greeks living in the age when this poem was finally composed had no direct memory of the palace world at all, only a hazy, half-legendary sense that their own more distant ancestors had once lived amid a wealth and a grandeur their own more modest age could no longer match. This matters to tonight's story because it means the honour economy this poem describes so precisely was not, By the time the poem reached its final form, a living, functioning system its audience could simply observe operating in the world around them. It was already, in some real sense, an inherited memory of a vanished world, remembered and reconstructed across centuries of oral transmission by poets who had never themselves seen a Mycenaean palace in its own prime, which makes the sheer internal coherence and precision of the system we have spent tonight examining all the more remarkable, a genuinely functional social logic, preserved with startling fidelity across a genuine historical rupture, by nothing more durable than the memory of singers passing a story from one generation of listeners to the next. There is a useful comparison worth drawing here, and this channel has drawn comparisons like it before when trying to make an ancient value system feel less alien than it first appears, because honour cultures of this particular shape, cultures in which a man's worth is measured almost entirely by publicly recognised deeds and can be catastrophically diminished by a public slight, regardless of any private feeling involved, did not disappear with the Bronze Age. Historians and anthropologists who have studied duelling cultures in early modern Europe, the elaborate codes of honour that governed everything from Renaissance Italian courts to the American antebellum South, or the honour and shame systems that still structure social life across large stretches of the Mediterranean and the Middle East today, have described again and again the same underlying mechanism. In a world where a man's honour functions as his actual load-bearing social capital, rather than as a mere feeling that can be privately absorbed and set aside, an unanswered public insult is not simply painful, it is functionally catastrophic, because it invites every other man watching to conclude that this particular man's claims to respect, to authority, to safety, can now be violated by anyone without consequence, because the one man who ought to have defended those claims failed to do so when it actually mattered. A duel fought over what looks, from the outside, like an absurdly trivial remark was rarely in these cultures actually about the remark itself. It was about the fact that the remark had been made in public, and that failing to answer it in public would have been read by every other man in that same social world as proof that the insulted man's own standing could now be treated as worthless. Achilles, sitting in his own tent with the ashes of a stripped honour cooling in front of the entire assembled Greek army, was operating inside exactly this same logic, only with stakes that a duel in a Renaissance courtyard never quite reached, because the entire meaning of his own life, as we are about to see, had been staked on precisely this currency, and no other. Two kinds of immortality, and why only one of them was ever actually on offer. It is worth pausing, before we turn to the mechanics of gift-giving itself, on a distinction buried inside the very bargain Achilles had struck with his own fate, because it clarifies something that a quick summary of the two fates' choice tends to flatten. When we say that Achilles traded a long life for undying glory, it is worth being precise about what kind of immortality was actually on the table, because it was never, in any version of this bargain, personal immortality in the sense of Achilles himself continuing to exist, to feel, to experience anything at all beyond the moment of his own death. The kleos he was promised was not survival, it was memory, the persistence of his name and his deeds in the mouths and the songs of people who would never meet him, a form of immortality that Achilles himself would never be present to witness, experience or enjoy in any way, because by the very terms of the bargain he would already be dead, entirely and permanently by the time that fame reached its fullest extent. It is worth sitting with how strange this actually is as a trade, because it means Achilles was never, even under the most favourable possible reading of his own choice, purchasing anything for himself in any straightforward sense. He was purchasing something for other people, for the future audiences who would hear his story sung around fires and read in books he could never have imagined, For his own father, perhaps, in whatever pride an old man might take in a dead son's undying fame, but not in any way a modern person would recognise as meaningful for himself, since the self doing the purchasing would be gone, entirely and irreversibly, at the exact moment the purchase was supposed to pay out. This is worth holding in mind as we consider why the theft of Briseis wounded him so catastrophically, because it means the honour he had been promised, the jeers and the recognition of his own contemporaries, was never simply a pleasant bonus attached to his real prize of undying fame. It was, in practice, the only part of the whole bargain he would ever actually be alive to experience and enjoy. The recognition of the men standing around him in the present, watching him fight and win and receive his due, was the only currency in this entire transaction that could actually be spent and felt within his own remaining lifetime, everything else being a promise redeemable only after he was no longer present to redeem it. Seen this way, the theft of Briseis was not simply an insult to Achilles' future reputation. It was an attack on the only living, breathing, currently redeemable portion of an otherwise entirely posthumous bargain, and it is worth understanding why this raises the stakes of the whole crisis considerably higher than a simple insult to reputation might otherwise suggest. A man whose payment is due entirely after his own death has, by definition, no way of confirming, while he's still alive to care about it, that the payment will actually be honoured in full, and the one piece of tangible present evidence he does have access to, the visible respect and the visible prizes granted to him by the other men who will presumably go on to tell his story after he is gone, becomes, under this pressure, an enormously important signal, a kind of down payment on a promise that cannot otherwise be verified until it is far too late to do anything about a broken one. When Agamemnon publicly seized that down payment, he was not merely wounding Achilles' present standing. He was undermining the only available evidence Achilles had, in his own remaining lifetime, that the entire, much larger, much longer bargain he had staked his whole existence upon was ever going to be honoured at all, and it is worth carrying this reading with you into the rest of tonight's story, because it deepens, rather than replaces, everything else we have already built about why this particular theft mattered as much as it did. A gift economy with no accountant. Before we go any further, it is worth pausing on the actual mechanics of gift giving in this world, because a modern listener, hearing that Agamemnon offered Achilles 7 tripods and 10 talents of gold and 12 prize horses and a king's own daughter, will almost automatically translate that offer into the language of a modern transaction, a very large sum of money being offered as compensation, roughly the way a company might offer a generous settlement to make an aggrieved employee go away quietly. That translation, understandable as it is, actually obscures the single most important thing about how gifts functioned in the world this poem describes, because in a society with no reliable currency in our sense, no banks, no markets deep enough to set a stable price on a horse or a cauldron, independent of who was giving it and who was receiving it, a gift was never simply a transfer of value from one party to another. It was a social act, freighted with meaning that had almost nothing to do with the market value of the object changing hands, and almost everything to do with the relationship the gift was meant to create, or repair, or announce, between the two men involved. Anthropologists who have spent careers studying societies organised around gift exchange rather than market exchange, from the elaborate ceremonial gift-giving of the Pacific Northwest, where chiefs would sometimes give away or even destroy enormous quantities of accumulated wealth in a single ritual display, precisely because the giving itself, not the wealth, was the point, to the great ceremonial exchange networks that once linked island communities across the Western Pacific, trading ornamental shell necklaces and armbands along a fixed ritual circuit for reasons that had nothing to do with the object's practical usefulness and everything to do with the standing, the alliances and the obligations the exchange itself created, have described again and again a single recurring insight that applies with real force to the scene we have spent tonight examining. In a gift economy, a gift is never actually free, and it is never actually finished the moment it changes hands. It creates an obligation. The receiver of a gift becomes, in some real and socially binding sense, indebted to the giver, bound into a relationship of reciprocity that the giver can, if he chooses, use to establish or reinforce his own standing relative to the man who received it. A sufficiently large gift, offered publicly, does not merely enrich the man who receives it. It can also, depending on the specific social context, subtly diminish him by placing him in the position of a man who has received more than he has yet given back, a position of at least temporary and visible dependency on the generosity of another man. This matters enormously to understanding what Agamemnon was actually offering Achilles in that tent, because the offer was never simply a transfer of wealth designed to make an aggrieved man whole again in some neutral arithmetic sense. It was, whether Agamemnon fully intended it this way or not, an offer that would have re-established the entire relationship between the two men on Agamemnon's own terms, with Achilles cast, once again, in the position of a subordinate receiving largesse from a superior, exactly the relationship that the original theft of Briseis had already exposed as unreliable and, in Achilles' own account, unbearable. A man in Achilles' position, examining this offer with real clarity, might reasonably have concluded that accepting it would not restore the balance the theft had disturbed at all, but would instead simply reenact, in a gentler and more generous key, the very same underlying relationship of dependency that had produced the original insult in the first place. Achilles once again positioned as a man whose worth is determined entirely by what a more powerful man chooses to grant him, whether that grant takes the form of a stolen prize or a lavishly restored one. This is, I think, part of what Achilles means when he tells Odysseus that he despises a man who conceals one thing while saying another, because underneath the generous surface of Agamemnon's offer lies an unchanged structural reality, that Achilles' own standing continues to depend entirely on Agamemnon's own will, a will that has already been demonstrated once to be unreliable, and that no quantity of gold can actually make reliable again, because gold was never the thing that had broken in the first place. There is a further wrinkle worth pausing on here, because in a genuine gift economy, refusing a gift is itself a meaningful and often a genuinely aggressive social act, not the passive non-event a modern listener might assume it to be. To refuse a gift offered in good faith is, in many of the societies anthropologists have studied along these lines, one of the most serious insults a person can deliver, because it is a public declaration that the relationship the gift was meant to establish or repair is not wanted, that the giver's own generosity, however large, is being treated as insufficient or even irrelevant to the actual matter at hand. When Achilles refuses Agamemnon's offer in front of Odysseus, Ajax and Phoenix, three men who will inevitably carry the news of that refusal back to the whole assembled camp, he's not simply declining a payment, he is delivering, in the very same gift economy logic that governs everything else in this world, a second and in some ways even more pointed insult back at Agamemnon, a public announcement that even Agamemnon's most generous possible gesture is being judged insufficient to the scale of what was actually done. And it is worth sitting with the audacity of that move for a moment, because it means Achilles' refusal was never simply passive. It was an act, deliberately chosen, inside a social language every man in that tent understood fluently, a language in which the rejection of an enormous gift carries a weight of its own, entirely separate from whatever material consequences the rejection might produce. Two different ways a society can teach a person how to behave. It is worth pausing, before we return to that half-drawn sword, on a broader framework worth laying out plainly, because it helps explain why the honour economy we have spent so much of tonight reconstructing looks, to modern eyes, so different from the moral vocabulary most of us grew up inside. A considerable body of scholarship examining early Greek moral psychology has drawn a useful, if necessarily simplified, distinction between what gets called a shame culture and what gets called a guilt culture, two broadly different mechanisms by which a society trains its members to behave well, and it is worth walking through that distinction here, because Achilles' whole world sits, by this account, considerably closer to the first category than to the second, and understanding the difference clarifies a great deal about why his refusal took the specific, publicly staged shape it did. In a guilt culture, roughly speaking, the mechanism that keeps a person behaving well is understood to be internal and private, an individual conscience that continues to judge a person's actions even when no one else is watching, so that a private wrongdoing, entirely unwitnessed by any other person, can still produce the full weight of moral consequence inside the wrongdoer's own mind. A felt sense of guilt that operates independently of whether anyone else ever learns what happened. In a shame culture, by contrast, the primary mechanism is understood to be considerably more external and more dependent on witness, a person's behaviour governed largely by the anticipated judgment of their own community, so that an act committed in complete privacy, with no witnesses and no possibility of discovery, carries, within this framework, a meaningfully different moral weight than the very same act committed in public, because the psychological and social consequence is generated primarily by the act of being seen and judged, rather than by some independent private moral faculty operating identically, whether anyone else is watching or not. It is worth being careful here, because this distinction, useful as it is, should not be pushed too far or treated as a rigid, binary sorting of entire civilizations into one category or the other, and a great deal of more recent scholarship has rightly pushed back against treating it as a clean historical boundary, since every society this channel has ever studied across a great many long nights turns out, on close inspection, to blend both mechanisms together in its own particular proportions, the way we have already seen this same Homeric world display a genuine internal dimension, eidos, alongside its more famous and more externally oriented time. But it is worth holding on to the distinction loosely, as a useful lens rather than a rigid law, because it explains something real about why Achilles' own crisis had to be resolved, or at least addressed, in such a thoroughly public and thoroughly witnessed manner. In a culture where a very great deal of a person's own sense of moral standing is generated and maintained through the visible judgment of the surrounding community, a private, unwitnessed apology, however sincere, could never have carried the same weight as a public one, and a private, unwitnessed restoration of Achilles' stolen prize could never have carried the same weight as the very public theft that preceded it. The wound was public because the entire mechanism by which this society generated and maintained a person's sense of their own worth was itself fundamentally public, and it is worth carrying this framework alongside everything else we have built tonight, because it helps explain, in yet one more register, why gold delivered quietly through three respected intermediaries, however generous, could never actually have closed a wound this specifically and this thoroughly public in its original infliction. A sword half drawn, and the restraint the poem could only explain as a goddess. It is worth returning for a longer look to the single most physically dramatic moment of this entire crisis, the instant when Achilles' own hand moves toward the hilt of his sword in front of the whole assembly, because we touched on it earlier tonight only briefly, in service of a narrower structural point, and it deserves fuller attention here, in light of everything we have since built about Aidos and the internal private dimension of this whole crisis. The poem tells us that Achilles stood there, genuinely undecided for a handful of seconds, weighing two live and specific options, drawing his sword and cutting down the man who had just humiliated him in front of the entire army, or governing his own fury and holding back. And it is worth pausing on how the poem stages the resolution of that indecision, because it does not resolve it through any argument, any calculation of consequences, any of the structural reasoning about coalition politics that we spent an earlier stretch of tonight's story reconstructing on Achilles' behalf. It resolves it through the direct intervention of a goddess, Athena descending from Olympus, visible to Achilles alone among the entire crowd, seizing him by his own golden hair and counselling him toward patience. It is worth pausing on what kind of explanation this actually is, because a modern reader accustomed to psychological realism is likely to read this scene as the poem's own slightly clumsy way of dramatising an internal moment of self-restraint that a more modern narrative technique might simply describe directly, Achilles' own better judgment overriding his own fury, personified for the sake of vividness as an external divine visitor. That reading is not wrong, and this channel has reached for a version of it more than once across other nights spent in this same poetic tradition. But it is worth sitting too with a second and complementary possibility, because the ancient audience for this poem did not necessarily experience internal psychological conflict, the way a modern audience raised on centuries of introspective literature has learned to experience it as a single unified self debating with itself in private. The Homeric self, as a considerable body of careful scholarship on this exact question has argued, appears to have been understood as something more porous and more multiply-authored than that, a self that could genuinely experience an unexpected impulse toward restraint, as something closer to an external visitation, a force arriving from outside the boundary of the self, rather than welling up from some interior reservoir of self-control the person already knew themselves to possess. It is worth pausing on why this distinction matters to tonight's whole investigation, because it means the moment of restraint we're examining here should not be read as clear and confident evidence that Achilles, deep down, already knew violence was the wrong choice, and simply needed a dramatic device to arrive at a conclusion he had secretly reached on his own. It should be read instead as a moment of genuine, unresolved uncertainty, a man who might, with equal plausibility, have gone the other way, and who experienced whatever ultimately held him back as something that did not feel, from the inside, entirely like his own doing. This matters because it means the Aidos we discussed a little earlier, the internal sense of shame or restraint that kept Achilles from drawing that sword, was not, for this poem's own original audience, simply a synonym for ordinary self-control in the modern sense. It was something closer to a fragile, external, and genuinely uncertain force, capable of arriving just in time to prevent a catastrophe, but never guaranteed to arrive at all, and it is worth carrying that uncertainty with you, because it means the entire rest of this story, the philosophically serious refusal, the embassy, the eventual return, all of it, unfolds in the shadow of a version of this same crisis that very nearly took an entirely different and considerably bloodier shape in those first few unsteady seconds, resolved by something the poem itself, for all its confidence elsewhere, was only willing to explain as the intervention of a god. It is worth pausing too on how completely alien this whole framework can feel to a modern audience raised inside market economies, where gifts, however meaningful in their own personal way, exist alongside and are ultimately backstopped by an entirely separate system of wages, prices, and legally enforceable contracts, so that even a badly handled gift rarely threatens a person's actual economic survival or social standing in any structural sense. the world Achilles inhabits offers no such backstop. Gift exchange between powerful men was not one mechanism among several for establishing status and obligation in that world. It was very close to the only mechanism, and it is precisely because there was no other system standing behind it, no market that could independently verify a man's worth apart from what other men publicly chose to grant him, that the entire elaborate ritual of offence and gift and refusal we have spent tonight examining carried the stakes it carried. Achilles was not naive to the value of what Agamemnon was offering him. He understood its value with total clarity. Understood, in fact, better than most men in that army could have understood, exactly what it would mean to hold that much wealth and that much royal favour. And he refused it anyway, because he had done the deeper arithmetic that a gift economy asks of anyone paying real attention to it, and had concluded that this particular gift, however large, would not actually purchase what he needed it to purchase, which was not wealth at all, but a genuinely independent, genuinely reliable guarantee that his own worth could never again be arbitrarily revised downward by the whim of the man standing above him. It is worth pausing, too, on how thin and how constantly at risk this whole system actually was, because a currency that exists only in the form of public recognition, with no institution standing behind it to guarantee its value, the way a modern central bank stands behind a printed note, is a currency that can be devalued instantly by a single act, performed by a single powerful man in front of the wrong witnesses. There was no appeals process available to Achilles. There was no court he could bring Agamemnon before, no independent authority who could rule on whether the seizure of Briseis had been lawful or unlawful, fair or unfair, because Agamemnon was, within the structure of this particular expedition, the single highest authority present, the man other kings had agreed, however reluctantly, to follow as commander of the whole assembled host. When the very top of a hierarchy commits the violation, there is no higher tier left to appeal to, and this fact, more than any single insult contained within it, is what made Agamemnon's specific choice so uniquely dangerous to the entire structure the army depended on. If the supreme commander himself could seize another man's publicly recognized prize of honor whenever his own pride demanded it, then the entire concept of Jairus, the entire idea that a man's deeds translated reliably into a man's recognized worth, was revealed, in that single instant, to be worth nothing at all whenever it collided with the will of whoever happened to hold the most power. Every other warrior in that army, watching this unfold, was watching something far larger than a dispute over one captive woman. They were watching a live demonstration of whether the entire value system that governed their own lives, the system that told each of them their own risked blood would be repaid in recognized honor, could actually be trusted to hold, or whether it could simply be overridden, at will, by whoever happened to be standing at the top of the chain of command on any given day. A bargain that leaves no room for a discount. But there is a second layer underneath this first one, a layer specific to Achilles alone among every other man on that beach, and it is this second layer that turns an ordinary, if serious, honor violation into something closer to an existential crisis. And to understand it, we have to go back, briefly, to a decision Achilles made long before this particular war, a decision this channel has told in fuller detail elsewhere, but that has to be summarized again here tonight, because tonight's whole argument is built directly on top of it. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, knew two mutually exclusive fates that stood open to her son from the very beginning of his adult life, and told him of them plainly. If he stayed home in the small, safe, comfortable kingdom his father ruled, he would live a long, ordinary life, marry, raise children, grow old surrounded by people who loved him, and be forgotten, eventually, the way every ordinary human life is eventually forgotten, folded back into the vast anonymous mass of lives that history simply does not have room to remember in any individual detail. If, instead, he sailed to Troy and fought in this war, he would win Kleos Aphthiton, glory that does not decay, a fame so total that his name would still be spoken thousands of years after his own death, and he would pay for that fame with his own life, cut short, dying young on foreign soil before he had lived even half the years an ordinary man might reasonably expect. Achilles chose Troy, and it is worth pausing at real length on exactly what kind of transaction that choice actually represents, because this is the piece of the puzzle that a purely narrative telling of the story tends to mention once and then set aside, when in fact it needs to sit at the very centre of everything that happens later, because it is the mechanism, the actual engine, that explains why the theft of Briseis mattered so catastrophically more to Achilles than it would have mattered to almost any other man in that army. Every other soldier camped on that beach, Agamemnon included, retained, at least in theory, the fallback option that Achilles had already, deliberately and irrevocably, given up. An ordinary soldier who lost his own prize of honour in some humiliating dispute could console himself, at least partially, with the thought that his life still held other kinds of value, a family waiting for him at home, a kingdom to return to, years of ordinary living still ahead of him regardless of how this particular war turned out. Achilles had traded all of that away in advance, consciously, with his eyes open, for exactly one thing and one thing only, a fame that would outlive him, purchased at the cost of everything else a human life might otherwise offer. This means that honour, for Achilles specifically, was never simply one good thing among several other good things a man might reasonably want out of his own existence. It was the entire and only return on the single, largest investment a human being can possibly make, the investment of his own remaining years. And once you understand the trade in those terms, you can start to see why an insult to his honour could not simply be absorbed the way an insult to an ordinary man's honour might eventually be absorbed, with time, with distraction, with the slow accumulation of other satisfactions life still had to offer him. Achilles had no other satisfactions coming. He had spent them all in advance on a single bet, and the entire payout of that bet was denominated exclusively in the very currency Agamemnon had just publicly and deliberately devalued. Think of it, if it helps to think of it this way, the way a modern person might think about an entire life's retirement savings, invested decades in advance in a single account that cannot be touched or added to until the day it finally matures, an account a person has consciously chosen to fund at the cost of every other form of security an ordinary working life might otherwise provide. No diversified portfolio, no other assets held in reserve, everything staked on the single promise that this one account and no other will eventually pay out in full. Now imagine that the institution holding that account, the very institution whose entire authority rests on the promise that deposits made in good faith will be honoured when they come due, simply seizes a portion of the balance, publicly, in front of every other depositor, on nothing more than its own say-so, with no legal recourse available to appeal the decision. The material amount seized might be, in absolute terms, relatively modest, but the psychological and practical damage done is not measured by the size of the specific withdrawal. It is measured by what the seizure proves about the reliability of the entire institution, because if the institution can seize a portion of the balance once, arbitrarily, whenever its own convenience demands it, then the entire promise the depositor originally staked his whole future on has just been revealed to be worthless, not merely diminished but worthless, because a promise that can be broken once without consequence was never actually a promise at all, only a story the institution told to keep the deposits coming in. This is, as close as I can put it in modern terms, exactly the shape of what happened to Achilles in front of the entire Greek army, and it is why no ordinary compensation, however generous, could actually undo the damage, a point we're going to return to at real length once we reach the embassy itself later tonight, because it turns out Achilles understood this distinction with a clarity that took the rest of the intellectual tradition that followed him the better part of 2,500 years to fully articulate in its own terms what the body knows before the mind agrees. It is worth pausing, before we return to the specifics of Agamemnon's public announcement, on the actual physical language the old poem uses to describe Achilles' reaction, because it tells us something important about how this whole tradition understood the relationship between an insult and a body, a relationship considerably closer and considerably less metaphorical than most modern readers assume when they encounter phrases like "his heart was torn" or "his blood boiled" and read them as mere poetic decoration. The Homeric world did not draw the same firm line. Modern thought is inclined to draw between the mind, where insults are supposedly processed as abstract information, and the body, where physical injuries are processed as concrete sensation. The old poem describes anger and grief alike as forces that act directly and violently on specific physical organs. The thumos, a word that gets translated imperfectly as spirit or passion, but that the poem treats as something closer to a physical seat of emotion lodged in the chest, capable of swelling, of boiling, of being addressed directly by its own owner as though it were a separate, half-independent creature that a man has to argue with and sometimes physically restrain. When Achilles' hand moves toward his own sword in that assembly, the poem is not describing a calm, rational man calculating his best strategic response to an insult. It is describing a body already in motion, a thumos already swelling toward violence, and the goddess who restrains him is restraining not an abstract decision, but something closer to a physical reflex already partway into its own execution. It is worth pausing on why this matters to tonight's whole argument, because it suggests that the scale of Achilles' reaction should not be read as a considered escalating response to an insult that a cooler, more reasonable man might have absorbed more gracefully. It should be read, instead, as something closer to what modern researchers studying the physiology of social pain have spent the last several decades documenting with increasing precision: the discovery that public humiliation and social exclusion appear to activate many of the same neural pathways in the human brain that register genuine physical injury, so that the language people reach for instinctively when describing a severe public humiliation, that it felt like being struck, that it felt like a physical blow, turns out to be considerably less metaphorical than earlier generations of psychologists assumed. A public status violation of the kind Agamemnon inflicted on Achilles does not register in the body of the person experiencing it as a purely abstract informational update to be weighed calmly against other information. It registers, at least initially, as something closer to an actual assault, and the body's own first-line response to an assault is rarely calm deliberation. It is the same fight-or-flight machinery that any threatened animal reaches for: adrenaline and a narrowing of attention and a powerful urge toward immediate physical action, exactly the urge we watch Achilles' own hand obey for those few unsteady seconds, before some slower, more deliberate part of him, dramatized by the poem as the intervention of a goddess, finally manages to override it. This reframing matters because it changes the moral question we are actually asking about Achilles' initial reaction, separate from the moral question we ask about his later, sustained refusal. The initial reaction, the hand on the sword, the fury boiling up in front of the whole assembly, looks considerably less like a character flaw specific to an unusually proud man once we understand it as something closer to a body's automatic and near-universal response to a genuine status assault. A response that any human being wired, the way human beings are actually wired, would have some version of, whatever their own particular temperament. What separates Achilles from an ordinary soldier suffering an ordinary insult is not that he felt this reaction more intensely than another man would have felt it in his place, though the poem certainly suggests he did, being built, by every account, on a larger emotional scale than most of the men around him. What separates him is that the specific bargain he had made with his own fate, the trade of an ordinary long life for an extraordinary short one measured out entirely in honour, meant that this particular assault landed on ground that had already been stripped of every other form of psychological cushioning an ordinary man might have had available to him. A soldier, with a home and a family and a long life still theoretically ahead of him, has other reservoirs to draw on when his pride is wounded, other sources of meaning that remain untouched by a single public humiliation, however severe. Achilles had spent those reservoirs in advance, and so the same wound that another man might have absorbed, painfully but survivably, over the course of weeks or months, struck him with nothing standing between the blow and the whole undefended structure of his own sense of worth. It is worth pausing finally on how long this particular wound actually took to metabolize, because the poem does not show us a man who processes his own fury quickly and then settles into a stable, considered position. It shows us a man whose anger keeps finding new shapes across the following books, curdling first into a prayer to his own mother, asking the god of thunder himself to let the Greek army suffer until it recognizes what it has lost, then into the philosophically serious refusal we spent the earlier part of tonight examining, then, after Patroclus's death, into something that goes past anger entirely into a kind of controlled, purposeful devastation that the poem itself seems to find almost frightening to describe, a river god rising up in genuine terror against the sheer accumulated violence of what Achilles has become. This long, evolving arc of a single wound, initial shock giving way to considered argument giving way, eventually to something closer to total psychic breakdown once a second, and far greater loss lands on top of the first, is worth holding on to as we move through the rest of tonight's story, because it means we're never really examining a single static emotion here at all. We're examining a wound that keeps reopening, deepening, and changing shape, exactly the way real grief and real fury tend to behave in any human being who has not yet found a way to set them down. An insult measured not in what was taken, but in who was watching. It is worth pausing now on the specific mechanics of how Agamemnon actually delivered this blow, because the manner of the taking mattered nearly as much as the taking itself, and a careful look at the scene shows us a commander who seems to have understood with real and deliberate precision exactly how to maximize the damage of what he was doing, whether or not he consciously intended the full consequences that followed. Agamemnon did not quietly request that Achilles surrender Briseis in some private negotiation conducted away from the rest of the army's eyes. He announced his intention in the middle of a full military assembly, in front of every king, every captain, and a great many ordinary soldiers besides, naming Achilles specifically and naming Briseis specifically, turning what could have been handled as a private matter between two proud men into a spectacle witnessed by the entire chain of command at once. This detail matters enormously to anyone trying to understand why Achilles' own reaction was so immediate and so total. Because in a value system built entirely around public recognition, the venue of an insult is not a minor detail. It is very close to the whole substance of the insult itself. An identical material loss, delivered privately, absorbed quietly and never spoken of again, could plausibly have been managed, negotiated, perhaps even forgiven over time, the way private grievances between powerful men are so often managed away from public view in almost every hierarchical society history has ever produced. But a loss inflicted publicly, in front of the very men whose respect constituted the entire substance of Achilles' own claim to worth, could not be managed quietly, because the damage was never really contained in the material transaction at all. It was contained in the fact of the audience, in the specific irreversible knowledge, now shared by every witness in that assembly, that Agamemnon had done this publicly, and that Achilles had, in that first stunned moment, done nothing to stop it. This is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it explains something that puzzles modern readers coming to this story for the first time: the sheer scale of Achilles' reaction relative to what looks, on paper, like a fixable problem. If honour in this world were simply a private feeling, the proportionate response to having a prize reassigned might reasonably have been disappointment, followed by negotiation, followed, eventually, by some kind of settlement. But honour in this world was not a private feeling. It was a public fact, continuously re-established through public witness, and a public fact, once falsified in front of a sufficient number of witnesses, cannot simply be quietly corrected later, the way a private misunderstanding can. Every man who watched Agamemnon take Briseis without consequence now carried, in his own memory, a data point that could never fully be erased, regardless of what happened afterward: that the single greatest warrior in the entire Greek army had been publicly humiliated by his own commander, and had not, in that immediate moment, been able to prevent it. Even if Agamemnon later returned everything he had taken, with interest, the fact of that original public moment would remain lodged, permanently, in the collective memory of every man who had witnessed it. A scar that no subsequent generosity could fully erase, because the wound was never actually located in the material loss. It was located in the witnessing itself, and witnessing, once it has happened, cannot be undone by any gift offered afterward, however lavish. A commander's own defence heard fairly. This channel has always tried, whenever it can, to resist turning any single figure in these old stories into a pure villain, because simple villainy tends to explain far less than it seems to, and it would be a disservice to Agamemnon and to the actual complexity of this whole crisis to leave him standing in tonight's story as nothing more than a petty tyrant who threw away an army's most valuable soldier out of pure spite. It is worth pausing, then, on the pressures bearing down on Agamemnon himself in the days immediately before he made this decision, because they were real and considerable, and worth taking seriously on their own terms, even if none of them in the end actually justify the choice he made. Agamemnon was not a king ruling a single unified kingdom with his own subjects bound to him by simple inherited loyalty. He was the elected, or at least the mutually agreed upon, supreme commander of a fractious coalition of dozens of independent kings, each one ruling his own separate territory, each one commanding his own separate contingent of soldiers, each one bound to this expedition, not by any formal chain of command in the modern sense, but by an old oath, sworn years earlier under very different circumstances, and by a fragile, constantly renegotiated consensus that Agamemnon's own wealth and standing made him the most suitable man to lead the whole assembled host. This is a genuinely difficult position to hold, considerably more difficult than ruling a single kingdom outright, because a coalition commander's authority is never actually secure in the way a hereditary king's authority might be. It exists only for as long as the other kings continue to recognise it, and it can be eroded, quietly and gradually, by any sequence of events that makes Agamemnon look weak, indecisive, or unable to enforce his own will against a subordinate, however talented that subordinate happens to be. It is worth pausing in this light on the specific sequence of events that led up to the Briseis decision, because Agamemnon did not simply wake up one morning and decide to humiliate his own greatest warrior for no reason. He had, in the days immediately prior, already been forced to back down publicly once, surrendering Chryseis to her father under pressure from a plague that was visibly killing his own soldiers, a surrender that a man in Agamemnon's precarious structural position might reasonably have feared would look, to the watching coalition of proud and independently powerful kings, like weakness, like a supreme commander who could be pushed around by circumstance and by the collective pressure of an assembly he was nominally supposed to be leading rather than following. Seen from inside Agamemnon's own anxious calculation, and the poem gives us real access to that calculation in his own words, taking a replacement prize from among the other Greek leaders was not simply an act of petty compensation for a personal loss. It was, in his own apparent reasoning, a necessary demonstration, delivered specifically and pointedly to the whole watching army, that his own authority as supreme commander had not been diminished by the earlier surrender, that he remained a man capable of claiming whatever he decided he was entitled to claim, regardless of whose prize it happened to be. This does not, and I want to be clear about this, actually excuse what followed, and it is worth being honest that Agamemnon's own solution to his own anxiety about appearing weak was to inflict a considerably greater and more dangerous humiliation on the one man in his entire army whose cooperation the whole expedition most desperately needed, a genuinely catastrophic miscalculation whichever way you look at it, whatever understandable fear was driving it. But it is worth naming plainly that Agamemnon's own choice, examined honestly, looks less like simple cruelty and more like the ordinary, all too recognizable failure of an insecure man in a precarious position, choosing, under pressure, to reassert his own authority in exactly the way that felt most immediately available to him, without adequately weighing the much larger cost that particular reassertion was about to impose on everyone around him, himself very much included. It is a failure of judgment every reader can probably recognize from somewhere in their own experience. Watching someone in a position of shaky authority overcorrect against a perceived challenge in a way that ends up causing far more damage than the original challenge itself ever threatened, and it is worth holding that recognizable human shape of the failure alongside the far more mythic and dramatic consequences it produced, because the gap between the two, an ordinary, almost banal failure of insecure leadership on one side and an entire war nearly lost on the other, is itself one of the oldest and truest observations this whole tradition of storytelling has to offer about how catastrophe actually enters the world, not usually through grand, deliberate villainy, but through smaller, more human failures of judgment that simply happen to occur at a moment when the stakes of getting it wrong are unusually, catastrophically high. It is worth pausing, too, on what Agamemnon actually stood to lose, in the coldest structural terms, by simply absorbing the loss of Chryseis without seeking any replacement at all, because it is worth taking seriously the possibility that a different kind of leader, a more secure, more genuinely confident one, might have found a way to accept that loss gracefully, framing his own surrender of Chryseis not as a weakness forced upon him by circumstance, but as a considered act of piety toward an angry god, a choice that a wiser commander could plausibly have spun in front of the same watching army as evidence of his own wisdom and his own proper respect for the gods rather than evidence of his own weakness. That Agamemnon did not see this alternative available to him, and reached instead for the one response guaranteed to inflict maximum damage on the coalition's own most valuable asset, tells us something worth sitting with about the specific kind of insecurity that seems to have gripped him throughout this whole episode. An insecurity that could apparently only imagine restoring its own damaged standing by taking something visibly and publicly from someone else, rather than by reframing its own recent loss in a way that might have cost the coalition nothing at all. It is one of the poem's quieter ironies, worth naming before we move on, that the very anxiety about appearing weak that drove Agamemnon's decision produced, in the end, exactly the outcome that anxiety was most desperate to avoid: a supreme commander whose own authority, once Achilles' withdrawal began to tell on the battlefield, looked considerably weaker in the eyes of the whole watching army than it would ever have looked had he simply let the original loss stand. A commander who could not be challenged, and a subordinate who had no other weapon. It is worth pausing too on the structural position Achilles actually occupied within this army, because it explains something else that a purely narrative retelling tends to skip past too quickly, namely why Achilles chose withdrawal specifically as his response, rather than any of the other options that might, in a different kind of story, have seemed more obviously available to him. He could not simply challenge Agamemnon to single combat and settle the matter with a sword, the way two men of roughly equal standing in this same monoculture might have settled a lesser dispute, because Agamemnon held a formal position of supreme command that Achilles, for all his individual battlefield superiority, was not structurally positioned to challenge directly without shattering the entire coalition the whole expedition depended on, an army made up of dozens of independent kings and their own separate contingents, held together by nothing firmer than a shared oath and a shared commander, whose authority, however resented by individual subordinates, was the one thing preventing the whole fragile alliance from simply dissolving into 24 separate kingdoms, each pursuing its own separate interests. We watch, in the poem's own account of this scene, Achilles' hand actually move toward the hilt of his own sword, weighing for a genuinely uncertain handful of seconds whether to draw it and kill his own supreme commander on the spot, a decision that would have ended the war then and there, and very possibly ended Achilles' own life along with it. And it is worth pausing on how close that moment actually came to happening, because it tells us that direct violent confrontation was, in fact, available to him as an option, considered seriously, and not merely as a rhetorical flourish. He did not take it, and the poem attributes his restraint to divine intervention, the goddess Athena seizing him by his own hair, visible to him alone among the crowd, and counselling patience. But it is worth reading that divine intervention, the way this channel has learned, across many other nights, to read divine intervention in these old stories generally, not as a literal supernatural event that overrides human agency entirely, but as the old poem's own way of dramatising an internal human calculation, the moment in which a furious man, weighing the catastrophic practical consequences of an act he's fully capable of carrying out, talks himself back from the edge and finds a different weapon instead. That different weapon was withdrawal, and it is worth pausing on why withdrawal, specifically, was the one form of retaliation genuinely available to a subordinate commander who could not simply depose or kill the man above him without destroying the entire structure both of them depended on. Achilles commanded the Myrmidons, an elite contingent whose battlefield value the whole army, Agamemnon included, understood to be disproportionate to their actual numbers, and he possessed, in his own individual person, a reputation for battlefield ferocity that every soldier on both sides of this war had already come to fear and depend upon in roughly equal measure. Withdrawing that contingent, and withdrawing his own participation alongside it, was the one lever a structurally subordinate man could pull that did not require overthrowing the structure itself, a form of protest that operated entirely within the existing rules of the game rather than attempting to break them. And it is worth noticing, because it is easy to miss, that this is precisely what makes his refusal so much more interesting, morally and strategically, than a simple act of violence would have been. A man who murders his commander in a fit of rage is a familiar and relatively simple figure, easy to condemn, easy to understand, easy to file away as a cautionary tale about uncontrolled temper. A man who instead chooses to withhold his own labour, his own skill, his own participation, deliberately and with full awareness of the catastrophic cost that withdrawal will impose on his own comrades, is doing something structurally closer to what a modern reader might recognise from an entirely different context. The deliberate withholding of essential service as a form of leverage against an authority that cannot otherwise be compelled to make amends. A tactic every society that has ever depended on a small number of genuinely indispensable people has had to reckon with in one form or another. Whether the indispensable person in question is a warrior, an army cannot win without, or a specialist a modern institution cannot function without. And it is worth sitting with the discomfort this comparison produces, because Achilles' withdrawal, seen this way, is not simply an act of wounded pride at all. It is closer to the oldest recorded labour action in the whole of Western literature, undertaken not by an oppressed worker against an exploitative employer, the frame a modern audience might reach for first, but by an indispensable specialist against a commander who had just publicly demonstrated that his services, however essential, could be devalued at will whenever the man at the top of the hierarchy found it convenient. It is worth pausing too on how the poem itself seems to understand the specific danger of what Achilles has actually done, because the withdrawal is not treated anywhere in the text as a minor or merely emotional gesture. It is treated as a genuine strategic catastrophe for the entire Greek army, one whose consequences unfold with real and mounting severity across the following books. The Trojans, under Hector's own increasingly confident leadership, driving the Greek forces steadily backward, breaching the defensive wall the Greeks had built around their own beached ships, and eventually setting fire to one of the ships themselves. A disaster that would have stranded the entire expedition on a hostile foreign shore with no possible way home, had it not been extinguished at the very last possible moment. This is worth dwelling on, because it means the poem itself is asking us to take the material consequences of Achilles' decision with total seriousness, refusing to treat his withdrawal as some kind of harmless sulking that the rest of the army could simply work around. He was not a disgruntled captain whose absence would be a minor inconvenience. He was the single load-bearing pillar of the entire military structure, and removing that pillar, however justified the underlying grievance may have been, brought the whole edifice within a hair's breadth of total collapse. And it is worth asking here a question that the poem itself seems genuinely uninterested in resolving cleanly: whether a grievance, however legitimate, can ever fully justify a response whose foreseeable consequences include the deaths of thousands of men who had no part whatsoever in causing the original offence. This is one of the questions we're going to keep circling back to across the rest of tonight's story, because the old poem, remarkably for a work this old, refuses to hand us a simple answer either way, a word for what happens when the whole system finally cracks. It is worth pausing before we widen our lens to other coalition armies across later history on a single further piece of vocabulary worth adding to tonight's growing collection of old Greek terms, because it names something we have circled around all evening without quite giving it its own proper word. The Greek language of this world had a term, nemesis, for the specific, almost cosmic form of retribution that falls on a person who has overstepped the proper measure of their own fortune, a concept later ages would flatten into a generic word for any old rival or arch-enemy, but that in this world carried something closer to the weight of a natural law, the conviction that excessive pride, excessive good fortune, excessive disregard for the proper limits owed to other people, invited a corrective response from the moral fabric of the universe itself, sooner or later, regardless of whether any human court or human army ever got around to enforcing it directly. It is worth pausing on whether Agamemnon's own conduct in this crisis reads, Through this particular lens, as a small human-scale instance of exactly the pattern Nemesis was meant to describe, a man whose own fortune and whose own formal authority had grown large enough that he mistook it, however briefly, for a license to treat a lesser but genuinely more deserving man's own claims as something he could simply override without consequence. And it is worth noticing that the whole catastrophe which follows, the plague, the withdrawal, the near destruction of the entire Greek army reads, examined this way, as something close to Nemesis in miniature, a corrective, delivered not by any god descending in judgment, but by the sheer, grinding mechanical consequence of removing the single most essential man from an army that could not actually survive without him. The universe, in this reading, did not need to intervene directly to punish Agamemnon's overreach. The overreach punished itself automatically the moment its own consequences began to unfold on the battlefield, and it is worth holding this observation alongside everything else tonight has built, because it suggests that the honour economy we have spent this whole evening examining was never simply an arbitrary social convention, fragile and enforceable only by the accident of who happened to hold the most power on a given day. It also, in its own way, carried its own built-in corrective mechanism, slower and considerably more costly than any court's verdict, but no less real for its slowness, a mechanism by which a system pushed too far out of its own proper balance, eventually, inevitably, found some way of forcing that balance back. Every army that ever had to argue about who mattered most, it is worth pausing before we return to the tent and the embassy waiting inside it, on how far beyond this one particular war the underlying problem actually reaches, because armies built out of coalitions rather than single unified chains of command have run into some version of this exact crisis again and again across the whole of military history, and it is worth taking a brief detour through a few of those later echoes, because they help confirm that what we're examining tonight is not simply a quirk of one strange Bronze Age poem, but a structural weakness built into any military alliance that depends on the voluntary cooperation of proud, independently powerful men. Medieval European feudalism, centuries later, and on an entirely different continent, developed its own formal answer to almost exactly this problem, a legal mechanism that some regions called, in various local languages, the right of diffidatio, the formal public renunciation of the bond of loyalty a vassal owed to his lord. A vassal who believed his lord had violated the terms of their mutual obligation, failing to protect him, failing to reward him justly, failing to honour the reciprocal duties the relationship was supposed to guarantee, was not, in many feudal legal traditions, expected simply to suffer the violation in silence, or to rebel outright in open treason. He was entitled, under specific and carefully hedged circumstances, to formally and publicly declare the bond broken, withdrawing his own military service and his own oath of loyalty through a recognised, almost ceremonial procedure, rather than through either quiet submission or outright violent rebellion. It is worth noticing how closely this medieval institution mirrors the structural position Achilles found himself in without any such formal mechanism available to him. A subordinate warrior whose superior has, in his own judgment, violated the terms of their relationship, choosing to withdraw his service rather than either submitting quietly to a broken bargain or resorting to the kind of open violence that would have destroyed the entire coalition outright. The medieval world eventually built formal legal scaffolding around exactly this impulse, because enough vassals faced with exactly this dilemma had already discovered, the way Achilles discovers it here, that withdrawal of service was the only proportionate response available to a man who could not simply murder his own superior without unleashing consequences considerably worse than the original grievance. It is worth pausing too on how often the specific danger of an indispensable subordinate's wounded pride has shaped the outcome of wars fought by coalitions considerably more recent than either the Trojan expedition or the feudal armies of medieval Europe. Because history is not short of examples of campaigns nearly lost or genuinely lost, because a commander in overall authority mishandled the pride of a subordinate whose particular skills or particular forces the whole campaign could not actually do without, a pattern so recurrent across so many different centuries and so many different cultures that military historians have had real reason to treat it as something close to a law of coalition warfare rather than a mere curiosity of any single conflict. Whenever an alliance depends on voluntary cooperation between formally equal or near equal partners, rather than on a single unquestioned chain of command capable of simply overriding any individual objection, the psychological management of pride, of visible respect, of the public acknowledgement of contribution, stops being a soft or secondary concern and becomes, in the most literal sense, a matter of strategic survival, because the alternative to careful management is exactly what we watch unfold in this poem. A coalition's own most valuable asset withdrawing from the field entirely rather than continue serving under terms that publicly diminish him, and an army discovering, often at exactly the worst possible moment, precisely how much of its own strength had depended all along on a single man's willingness to keep contributing it. It is worth carrying this wider pattern with us as we return now to the specific tent on the specific beach where tonight's central scene actually plays out, because it means we should read what follows not as an isolated psychological drama confined to one unusually proud Bronze Age warrior, but as one of the earliest and most fully realized surviving portraits of a structural problem that has recurred, in one costume or another, in almost every coalition army history has ever assembled. The problem of what happens when the men who hold the formal authority to command an alliance are not in fact the same men whose actual skill and actual courage the alliance's survival most depends upon, and the terrible recurring temptation those formal authorities so often feel, under pressure, to remind everyone watching exactly who is nominally in charge, regardless of what that reminder actually costs the alliance in the field. A man who had already shown the whole army exactly what he was willing to sacrifice, and what he was not. It is worth pausing before we turn to the council that finally forced Agamemnon's hand on a piece of this same king's own history that the wider tradition surrounding this war remembers clearly, even though it falls outside the specific stretch of days this poem itself narrates, because it sharpens considerably what we already understand about the particular kind of man Achilles found himself quarrelling with. Years earlier, before the fleet had even managed to leave Greek waters, Agamemnon had faced an earlier, and in some ways considerably crueler version of exactly the same underlying choice he now faces again in his own tent. A choice between his own personal cost and the army's collective need, when a becalmed fleet at the harbour of Aulis could not sail until, the prophets insisted, Agamemnon surrendered his own eldest daughter to the altar. He made that choice then, weighing his own child's life against the army's need and the whole expedition's momentum, and chose, in the end, the army and the expedition, a decision that cost him everything a father can lose, and that this whole wider tradition never lets him, or his own family, fully recover from. It is worth pausing on what this earlier history tells us about the specific kind of leader now facing Achilles' own fury, because it establishes, before this particular crisis even begins, that Agamemnon was a man demonstrably capable of paying an enormous personal price when the collective military necessity of the moment genuinely demanded it. A father who had already proven, in the cruelest possible way, that he would not let his own private feelings stand in the way of what he judged the army required, and it's worth holding that established capacity for sacrifice up against his own conduct in the crisis we've spent this whole evening examining, because the contrast is genuinely instructive. The sacrifice at Aulis cost Agamemnon something irreplaceable, but it cost him nothing in front of his own assembled peers in terms of visible authority or public standing, since a father grieving a daughter lost to the will of the gods remained, in the eyes of the watching army, a king submitting properly to necessity rather than a king losing face to a rival. The apology this crisis required of him, by contrast, would have cost him considerably less in any absolute sense, a public acknowledgement of his own fault and a reasonable restitution, but would have cost him something his own pride apparently found far harder to surrender than his own child, a visible public admission, in front of the same assembled peers, that his own judgment had been wrong and that a subordinate's objection had been right. It is worth sitting with what this comparison actually reveals, because it suggests that Agamemnon's failure in the crisis over Briseis was never really a failure of capacity for sacrifice in any general sense. He had already proven, at Aulis, that he could sacrifice almost anything the army's survival seemed to require. It was instead a much narrower and in some ways much more ordinary failure, a specific inability to sacrifice his own public standing among his fellow kings, a form of cost that apparently mattered to him more in the moment than nearly anything else this whole tradition ever shows him weighing. And it is worth carrying this observation into the rest of tonight's story, because it means the entire catastrophe that follows from his refusal to simply absorb the loss of Chryseis gracefully traces back not to a general absence of moral seriousness in the man, but to one very specific and very human blind spot, an inability to imagine that his own visible authority could survive a public admission of error, a blind spot that a great many people in positions of power across every century since have shared with him in exactly the same proportion. A council that had to find the courage to say it plainly first. It is worth pausing, before we return to the tent itself, on the council scene that actually produced this embassy, because the poem gives us real access to the political manoeuvring behind it, and that manoeuvring tells us something worth carrying forward about how differently the men around Agamemnon understood this crisis compared to Agamemnon himself in the first raw hours of his own anger. It was Nestor, the oldest and most experienced commander in the entire army, a man who had already outlived 2 full generations of other heroes and never let anyone forget it, who stood up in that desperate midnight council with Trojan campfires burning for the first time visibly close to the Greek ships, and said, in blunt terms no one else in the tent had yet dared say, to Agamemnon's own face, that the disaster now threatening the whole expedition traced directly back to a single decision Agamemnon himself had made, and that the only way out worth attempting was a genuine, generously compensated apology. It is worth pausing on the courage that took, because Nestor remained, in every formal sense, Agamemnon's own subordinate, and telling a supreme commander, in front of his entire assembled war council, that the current catastrophe was substantially his own doing, was not a small or a politically safe thing for even the most respected elder statesman in the camp to say aloud. It is worth noticing too that Agamemnon, to his own real credit, did not answer this blunt accusation with anger or denial, but accepted it, admitting, in the poem's own account, that he had indeed acted in a kind of madness, though he attributes that madness, in the convenient way powerful men in this world so often did, to the interference of the gods rather than to any failure of his own judgment. A small but telling piece of self-serving rhetoric worth noticing, even inside what otherwise reads as a genuine and reasonably humble admission of fault. It is worth holding on to this scene as we move into the embassy itself, because it tells us that the elaborate offer about to travel down the beach to Achilles' own tent was never simply Agamemnon's own spontaneous generosity. It was the product of real political pressure, applied by a council of powerful men who understood, with real clarity, exactly how much the whole expedition's survival now depended on repairing a breach that Agamemnon's own pride had opened. And it is worth remembering that pressure when we consider, as we did a little earlier tonight, why Agamemnon chose not to make the journey down that beach himself, delegating even this belated and politically necessary act of contrition to subordinates rather than fully absorbing in his own person the humbling his own counsel had just quietly forced upon him, the gifts that could not buy back what was actually lost. We return now, at last, to the tent on the beach, to the scene that opened tonight's story, because everything we have built up across the last stretch of this evening exists to prepare us to actually understand what happens when Odysseus, Ajax and old Phoenix arrive there together, and it is worth walking through the specific shape of their failure slowly, because the failure itself is where tonight's real argument lives. Agamemnon's offer, delivered through these three respected envoys, was not stingy, and it is worth being honest about that plainly, because a lesser story might have made this easier on itself by having Agamemnon offer some grudging, insufficient token of apology that Achilles could reasonably reject as an insult in its own right. That is not what happens here. The offer is, by any reasonable material measure, staggering. More wealth than most kingdoms in this world could expect to see change hands in a single transaction. Restoration of the specific woman whose loss had triggered the whole crisis. A solemn oath that she'd not been touched. And, layered on top of all of it, a marriage alliance to the royal house of Mycenae itself, with an entire province's worth of cities thrown in as dowry. An offer that would have transformed Achilles, materially, into one of the wealthiest and most securely connected men in the entire Greek world, whatever became of the war itself. Any ordinary calculation of costs and benefits, the kind of calculation an economist might run on a spreadsheet, would have told Achilles to take the deal immediately, and it is precisely because the offer is this generous, this carefully calibrated to look, on paper, like more than fair compensation, that his refusal of it becomes so philosophically interesting, because it forces us to ask what kind of loss could possibly exist that no quantity of gold, no number of cities, no marriage alliance, however prestigious, could actually repair. Achilles' answer to that question, delivered to Odysseus in a speech that a great many serious readers across nearly 3,000 years have judged to be the single most important passage in the entire poem, deserves to be walked through carefully, because it is doing something much more sophisticated than simply restating his anger in slightly more articulate terms. He tells Odysseus, in substance, that he despises a man who says one thing while concealing another in his heart, and that he intends to speak to him with total, unguarded honesty. And what follows is not a negotiation over terms at all, but something closer to a philosophical repudiation of the entire premise underlying the offer. The premise that a sufficiently large quantity of material wealth can always, given enough of it, purchase back whatever has been taken from a man. Achilles tells him, in effect, that he has come to see through the whole transaction, that the gifts on offer, however impressive their catalogue, cannot actually restore what was genuinely lost, because what was lost was never the specific woman or the specific cauldrons or the specific horses at all, useful and valuable as those things undeniably are. What was lost was the demonstrated, public, reliable connection between his own deeds and his own recognised worth, the very thing that made the entire system of honour meaningful to him in the first place, and no quantity of belated compensation, however generous, can retroactively repair a public demonstration that the connection had, in fact, never actually been guaranteed at all, that it had only ever held for as long as it happened to suit the man at the top of the hierarchy to honour it. This is the crucial move in the whole speech, and it is worth sitting with it for as long as it deserves, because Achilles is not simply saying the price on offer is too low. He is saying, with a philosophical precision that is genuinely startling to encounter in a text this old, that price and value are not the same kind of thing at all, that some losses exist in a category the language of gifts and compensation was never built to address, and that a man who tries to close that gap with gold has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what he is dealing with. It is worth pausing here on a distinction that the field of moral philosophy would spend the following 2,500 years slowly working its way toward in its own vocabulary. A distinction between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. A distinction that later thinkers, arguing about ethics in courtrooms and lecture halls a hemisphere and a couple of millennia removed from this particular tent on this particular beach, would eventually formalize under various names, but that Achilles reaches for instinctively and under real emotional pressure in this single speech. A price is, by its nature, negotiable, substitutable, capable of being paid in any sufficiently large quantity of an agreed-upon medium of exchange, gold for a horse, cattle for a bride, land for a debt. A value, in the sense Achilles is groping toward here, is none of those things. It cannot be substituted for, because it is not fungible, it is not interchangeable with any other good, however valuable the other good happens to be in its own separate terms. When a modern philosopher argues that human dignity cannot be traded off against any quantity of material benefit, however large, without something essential being lost in the trade, that argument is reaching for exactly the same underlying intuition Achilles is reaching for here, nearly 3,000 years earlier, in far cruder and far more personal terms, standing in a tent on a beach, furious and grieving and only half aware, probably, of exactly how philosophically radical his own outburst actually was. He's not simply angry that the price offered is insufficient. He is announcing to three of the most respected men in the entire army that the whole framework of price is the wrong framework entirely for understanding what has actually happened to him. And it is worth remembering that no one in that tent, not Odysseus, not Ajax, not Phoenix, seems fully equipped to answer him on those terms, because the entire society all four men belong to has never had to articulate this distinction so nakedly before. The quieter word that sits underneath, the louder one. It is worth pausing, before we follow Achilles' speech to its most radical conclusion, on a second old Greek word that hovers just beneath the surface of this entire crisis, quieter and less frequently discussed than time, honour, but arguably just as important to understanding why this particular quarrel could not simply be smoothed over through ordinary diplomacy. The word is eidos, usually translated as shame or reverence, or a kind of instinctive social restraint, and it functioned in this world as something like the internal psychological twin of the external honour economy we have spent so much of tonight examining, a felt sense lodged in a person's own chest alongside the thumos we discussed earlier, of what one owed to other people and what one could not do without becoming, in one's own eyes and not merely in the eyes of others, a lesser kind of man. It is worth pausing on why this internal dimension matters alongside the external one, because a purely external honour economy, one concerned only with public reputation, and never with a person's own private sense of right conduct, would actually predict a somewhat different outcome to this whole crisis than the one the poem actually gives us. A purely external calculation might have suggested that Achilles, once offered sufficiently generous public compensation, restored prize, formal acknowledgement, a marriage alliance, ought to have accepted the deal regardless of his own private feelings, since the public record from that point forward would have shown the debt repaid in full, whatever residual resentment he continued to carry privately. That Achilles refuses anyway, even when the external ledger has been generously balanced in his favour, tells us that something more than pure external accounting is actually at work in his own refusal. A private sense, closer to Eidos than to time, that accepting the gift would require him to become, in his own eyes, exactly the kind of man who can be brought back into line with sufficient wealth, a man whose own sense of what he owes himself, and not merely what the watching army owes him, would not survive the transaction intact. It is worth pausing too on how this distinction helps explain the specific, otherwise puzzling shape of Achilles' own refusal, a refusal that keeps circling back again and again across his own speech, to language of trust and honesty and concealment, hating a man who says one thing while hiding another, rather than settling into the simpler and more purely transactional language of insufficient compensation a purely external calculation might have produced. He is not haggling. He is describing, as precisely as the language available to him allows, a violation that has occurred somewhere closer to his own sense of who he is entitled to be, a violation that a purely external system of prizes and public rank was never actually built to register or repair, however elaborate the gifts on offer eventually became. It is worth carrying this quieter internal dimension alongside the louder, more visible economy of prizes and witnesses we spent the earlier part of tonight examining, because together the two of them, the external time and the internal eidos, form something considerably closer to a complete picture of what Achilles actually lost, and why no single external gift, however carefully calibrated, could ever have been sufficient on its own to restore it. A speech that outgrew its own occasion, and then, in the section of this same speech that reaches furthest beyond the immediate quarrel, Achilles does something that turns this scene from a story about wounded pride into something considerably stranger and considerably more radical, because he does not stop at rejecting Agamemnon's specific offer. He turns instead to interrogate the entire value system that had organised his own life up to this exact moment, the very bargain between a short, glorious life and a long-forgotten one that this whole story is built upon, and he tells Odysseus, in words that have troubled and fascinated readers for the whole of the intervening 3,000 years, that he has come, in the depths of this particular fury, to genuinely doubt whether the bargain was ever actually worth making at all. He lays out plainly the two fates his own mother had once described to him, and then adds something new to them, something the earlier telling of his own story never quite gave him room to say, a suggestion, delivered with real and startling directness, that he is inclined, in this very moment, to advise every other Greek soldier still camped on this beach to abandon the whole enterprise and sail home too, because Troy, in the end, is not worth what taking it is actually costing, and because he has come to believe, sitting here with his own grief and his own fury still raw, that a single day of a living man's life outweighs, in any honest accounting, all the cattle and gold and glory that Troy or any other city could ever offer in exchange for it. It is worth pausing here, at real length, on how far this single line actually travels from the specific occasion that provoked it, because a man who set out at the start of this speech to explain why he will not accept Agamemnon's gifts has ended it by questioning whether the entire war, the entire concept of glory purchased at the cost of a life, was ever a sound transaction to begin with. And this is precisely the moment in the poem where the whole story stops being reducible to a squabble over a captive woman and reveals itself as something closer to the oldest surviving example of a soldier, in the very heart of a war, standing up and asking whether the war itself is worth what it's asking of the men fighting it. This question did not disappear with the Bronze Age, and it is worth pausing briefly on how persistently it has recurred across every subsequent age of organised warfare this world has ever produced. Soldiers in every century since, standing in trenches and jungles and deserts their own poets have described in language that, stripped of its specific historical costume, would not sound entirely foreign to Achilles' own outburst in this tent. a soldier weighing the glory or the cause he has been promised against the plain, unglamorous, overwhelming value of simply staying alive to see another ordinary sunrise, and finding, in the depths of some particular grief or exhaustion, that the promised glory suddenly looks thin and insufficient against the weight of what it is actually asking him to give up. Achilles is, in this single speech, the ancestor of every one of those later voices, and it is worth remembering, as we sit with him here, that this radical doubt, once spoken aloud, cannot simply be unspoken again, however the rest of the story eventually turns out. It is worth being honest too about what makes this moment so genuinely unresolved, because Achilles does not, in the end, sail home, and the poem itself never gives us a fully satisfying explanation of why not, offering us instead a man caught between a conviction he has just spoken aloud, with real and apparent sincerity, and a fate he has already chosen years earlier and cannot now fully unchoose. A contradiction the old poem leaves standing, exposed and unresolved, rather than smoothing it over the way a tidier, more moralizing story might have felt obligated to do. This refusal to resolve the contradiction is, I think, one of the quiet marks of genuine artistic seriousness in this whole ancient text, because real grief and real anger do not, in actual human experience, resolve themselves into single consistent positions either, and a poem willing to let its own central hero contradict himself this openly, questioning the entire foundation of his own chosen life in one breath, and then, within the same speech, admitting he cannot fully act on that questioning, is a poem that trusts its own audience to sit with genuine moral complexity, rather than demanding a cleaner answer than the situation actually allows. It is worth carrying this unresolved tension with you through everything still ahead of us tonight, because it is going to matter enormously to how we understand what finally does bring Achilles back into the war, several books and several deaths later, a return that is going to look, when we get to it, considerably less like the restoration of his original bargain with glory, and considerably more like something else entirely. A word usually reserved for gods. It is worth pausing before we turn to the specific formula for undying glory on the very first word of the entire poem, because it bears directly on everything tonight's story has been arguing, and because its significance is easy to miss entirely in translation. The poem opens not with Troy, not with Helen, not with Agamemnon or the fleet, but with a single noun, menace, commonly rendered into English as wrath or rage, announced as the entire subject the poet is asking a goddess to help him sing. It is worth pausing on this specific word rather than treating it as an interchangeable synonym for ordinary anger, because careful study of how it gets used across the wider body of surviving Greek epic and religious poetry shows that menace was not in fact an everyday word for everyday human irritation. It was a comparatively rare and comparatively weighty term, most often reserved across the surviving evidence for the anger of the gods themselves, a specific cosmic scale fury capable of unleashing plagues and famines and other forms of large-scale divine punishment on a whole community, considerably closer in register to what a modern reader might associate with divine wrath in a religious text than with the ordinary human bad temper the English word anger tends to suggest. It is worth sitting with what it means, then, that the poem chooses this exact word, this specific and unusually weighty term more properly belonging to gods, to describe the fury of a single mortal man over the loss of a single captive woman, because the choice is doing real interpretive work before the poem has even finished its own opening sentence. It is telling its original audience in the very first breath of an enormously long performance that what they are about to hear is not simply a story about an insulted soldier sulking in his own tent. It is a story about a fury operating on a scale the ordinary vocabulary for human emotion was not really built to describe. a fury closer, in its actual destructive capacity to the plague Apollo sends down on the Greek camp only a few hundred lines later than to any ordinary quarrel between men. This single word, chosen with what looks like real deliberation, at the very threshold of the entire epic, is already announcing the argument this whole evening has been trying to make, that Achilles' refusal cannot be understood on the scale of an ordinary personal grievance, because the poem itself, from its very first syllable, refuses to describe it on that scale, reaching instead for the one word in its entire vocabulary usually kept in reserve for describing what an angry god does to an entire undeserving world, a single word that appears in this exact form only once. It is worth pausing before we move on to Phoenix and the story of Meleager on one small and very technical detail buried inside Achilles' own speech, because it turns out to matter a great deal more than its size would suggest, and because it gives us a rare, direct window into how deliberately the old poem is actually working at the level of individual word choice, rather than simply improvising in the moment the way an oral storyteller might be assumed to do. Scholars who have spent careers studying the formulaic language of Homeric verse, the great stock phrases and epithets, swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, that recur again and again across both epics, phrases built, originally, to help oral poets compose and remember enormously long poems on the fly, have noticed something genuinely striking about the specific phrase Achilles reaches for in this speech when he describes the glory he stands to win, kleos aphthiton, glory that does not decay, imperishable fame. That exact phrase, in that exact grammatical form, appears nowhere else in the entire surviving text of the Iliad, a poem that otherwise recycles its most important formulas constantly, sometimes dozens of times across its full length, and its closest linguistic relatives have been traced by careful philological comparison, all the way back to related formulas surviving in ancient Sanskrit poetry, describing the fame of legendary heroes on the far side of the Indo-European world, suggesting that this exact phrase, or something very close to it, is not a Homeric invention at all, but an inherited fragment of a much older poetic tradition, carried forward, formula intact, across an almost unimaginable span of centuries and across an entire family of languages, surviving in poetic memory long after the specific culture that first coined it had vanished entirely. It is worth pausing on why that single surviving fragment shows up here, and only here, in this exact speech, because the placement does not look like coincidence once you notice it. Achilles reaches for the single oldest, most ancient-sounding, most formally weighty phrase available anywhere in the entire poetic tradition, precisely at the moment he is describing the one thing he is being asked to weigh everything else against, the fame that will supposedly outlive him if he stays and dies at Troy. And it is worth considering the possibility, one that a number of careful readers of this poem have proposed, that the poet is using the sheer archaic weight of this borrowed ancient formula to underline exactly how enormous a promise Achilles is actually being asked to trade his life for, a promise so large and so ancient that the ordinary Homeric vocabulary, built and rebuilt fresh across generations of more recent composition, was not considered adequate to carry it, requiring instead a fossil phrase inherited from a poetic tradition already ancient by the time this particular poem was ever sung. And it is worth noticing too what Achilles does with that phrase in the very next breath, because having reached for the single oldest and weightiest word available to him for undying glory, he then turns around and tells Odysseus that he is inclined, in this very moment, to abandon the whole promise that phrase represents and sail home instead, a single living day, in his own reckoning, outweighing the entire ancient inherited 3,000-year promise of imperishable fame. It is a genuinely striking piece of poetic construction, whether or not the original poet consciously intended every layer scholars have since found inside it, because it means the single most philosophically radical line in the whole speech is delivered immediately after the single most ancient and weighty word in the whole poem, glory that does not decay set directly against a single day of a life that plainly does, and it is worth carrying that small, technical observation with you, because it tells us that whatever else this scene is doing, it is doing it with a formal, poetic precision that repays exactly the kind of close, patient attention this channel likes to give these old texts in the quiet hours of the night. The first name on a very long list. It is worth pausing before we examine exactly how subversive this speech would have sounded to its own original audience, on the considerably longer tradition of soldiers questioning the value of their own wars that Achilles' outburst effectively inaugurates, at least within the surviving literature of the Western world, because it is a tradition that runs, remarkably continuously, all the way down to the present day, and it is worth tracing a little of that later lineage here, briefly, because it helps confirm that what we are watching in this tent is not an isolated literary curiosity, but the earliest known instance of a recurring and genuinely universal human response to organised violence. Soldier poets writing out of the trenches of the First World War, nearly 3,000 years after Achilles first gave voice to this same doubt, produced an entire body of literature built around precisely the same underlying discovery, that the glory and the patriotic purpose promised to men before they went to war had a way of curdling, once those same men had actually witnessed the reality of sustained, industrial-scale killing, into something that felt considerably closer to a lie the survivors could no longer bring themselves to repeat. It is worth being careful here not to overstate the parallel, because the specific historical circumstances separating a Bronze Age siege from a 20th century trench war could hardly be more different, and this channel has no interest in flattening 3,000 years of genuinely different human experience into a single undifferentiated complaint about the horrors of war in general. But it is worth naming plainly the specific structural similarity worth carrying forward: a soldier who has given real and sustained service to a cause built on promises of glory and purpose, who has watched that cause exact a cost in death and suffering that begins to feel wildly disproportionate to whatever the promised glory could actually deliver, and who arrives, often quite suddenly, at a moment of genuine doubt about whether the entire framework of meaning he enlisted under was ever actually sound in the first place. That specific arc, promise, sustained sacrifice, mounting cost, sudden and often unwelcome clarity, recurs across an enormous span of later military history and later literature, and Achilles, standing in his own tent nearly 3,000 years before any of it, appears to be the first figure in the entire surviving Western literary tradition to give that particular arc its full and considered voice. It is worth pausing too on how the later tradition has generally treated soldiers who voice this same doubt, because the reception has rarely been simple or entirely sympathetic, any more than Achilles' own reception within this poem is entirely sympathetic. Soldiers across many later wars who express genuine doubt about the value of the causes they were fighting for have often faced accusations, from their own commanders and sometimes from their own comrades, of exactly the same charge levelled at Achilles by the more traditionally minded readers this channel discussed a little earlier tonight, that such doubt amounts to a failure of nerve, a betrayal of duty, a dangerous indulgence of private feeling at the expense of collective purpose. Precisely the reading Plato himself would later apply to this exact scene. And other readers, across those same later centuries, have found in exactly this same soldierly doubt something considerably closer to the opposite, the single most honest and most morally serious voice available inside any war, a voice willing to say plainly what a great many other participants privately suspect, but rarely have the standing or the courage to say aloud. It is worth noticing that this same argument, unresolved when we first encountered it in ancient philosophical commentary on Achilles' own conduct, has simply continued, in one costume after another, across every subsequent century of organised human warfare, never definitively settled in either direction, and it is worth understanding tonight's whole investigation as one small, careful contribution to an argument considerably older and considerably more durable than any single war it has ever been conducted about, every war's oldest, quietest heresy. It is worth pausing now and dwelling a while longer on exactly how dangerous this particular speech would have sounded to the original audience listening to it, because we are separated from that audience by enough centuries that it is easy to miss just how subversive Achilles' words actually were within the specific value system the whole poem otherwise seems to celebrate. This is, after all, a poem whose entire narrative architecture is organised around the pursuit of kleos, undying glory won through battlefield deeds, a value the poem elsewhere treats with something close to reverence, describing acts of martial courage in loving, extended, almost worshipful detail, naming fallen warriors individually even in the middle of chaotic mass combat, as though the poem itself understood its own primary function to be exactly the kind of glory preservation Achilles is, in this single speech, calling into question. And yet the poem hands its single most celebrated warrior, the very embodiment of everything the epic tradition claims to value most, a speech in which he looks directly at that whole value system and finds it, for one genuine and unresolved moment, wanting. This is not a minor character voicing dissent from the margins, easily dismissed as an outlier, whose views the poem does not actually endorse. This is Achilles, the hero the whole poem is named for in its opening line, the man whose wrath the poem's own first word announces as its entire subject, and it is worth asking what it means that a tradition this invested in celebrating martial glory was also willing, at its very centre, to let its own greatest exemplar of that glory stand up and question whether the whole enterprise was worth the cost. There is an old story embedded within this same scene, told by Phoenix, the elderly tutor who accompanies Odysseus and Ajax on this embassy, and it is worth pausing on that embedded story now, because it functions almost as a commentary on the very dilemma Achilles is caught inside, offered to him by the one man in the tent who had known him since childhood, and who reached in his own attempt at persuasion not for gifts or for blunt appeals to loyalty, but for a story about another hero who had once faced a nearly identical crisis. Phoenix tells Achilles of a warrior named Meleager, a hero of an earlier generation who, in a fit of wounded pride startlingly similar to Achilles' own, once withdrew from a desperate battle his own city needed him to win, refusing to fight until his own community had suffered catastrophic losses and had exhausted every other resource trying to win him back, offering him ever larger rewards the longer he held out. Exactly the pattern Achilles himself is living through in this very tent. And Meleager, in Phoenix's telling, did eventually return to the fighting, moved not by any of the elaborate gifts his own city had offered him, but by a far more intimate appeal from his own wife, and saved his city in the end. But by the time he finally relented, the city's gratitude had curdled into something closer to resentment, and he received none of the rewards that had originally been promised him, having waited too long to accept them, a warning Phoenix delivers with real and pointed urgency, that a man who holds out too long in his own wounded pride often finds, when he finally does relent, that the world's willingness to reward him has quietly expired in the meantime. It is worth pausing on why Phoenix reaches for this particular story, rather than any other argument available to him, because the choice reveals something important about how this ancient tradition understood the specific danger Achilles was courting. Phoenix is not simply telling Achilles that his anger is wrong, or that his grievance is unjustified, an argument he seems to understand would fail immediately against a man who has just spent an entire speech demonstrating with real philosophical seriousness exactly why his grievance cannot be dismissed so easily. Instead, Phoenix concedes the legitimacy of the anger and warns, instead, about the specific danger of timing, the danger that a protest, however justified in its original cause, can outlive its own usefulness, curdling from a legitimate assertion of worth into something closer to self-destructive stubbornness if it is held past the point where holding it any longer serves any purpose beyond the protester's own wounded pride. This is a genuinely sophisticated piece of practical wisdom, and it is worth noticing that the poem gives it to us not as an abstract moral lesson, but embedded inside a story, a technique. This whole ancient tradition seems to have understood instinctively that a hard truth delivered as narrative can sometimes reach a stubborn man's heart in ways that the same truth, delivered as a direct rebuke, cannot. Achilles, notably, is moved by this appeal more than by any of the material gifts Agamemnon has offered, though not moved enough in this scene to actually relent. A partial persuasion that leaves him exactly where the whole embassy scene ultimately leaves him. Refusing the war, but no longer, quite. Refusing it with his whole and undivided conviction. A messenger who edits the message he was sent to deliver. It is worth pausing before we move to Ajax and the partial concession that finally breaks this scene open on a small and easily overlooked detail in how Odysseus actually delivers Agamemnon's offer, because it turns out to be one of the more quietly revealing pieces of characterization in the whole episode, and it tells us something about how even the men trying hardest to resolve this crisis were still, themselves, operating with less than total honesty. When Agamemnon first laid out the terms of his offer to his assembled council, before the embassy ever set out, he attached to it a condition the poem records plainly, instructing his envoys to tell Achilles that alongside all the promised gifts, Achilles must yield to him, must acknowledge in so many words that Agamemnon is the greater king and the elder in this quarrel. When Odysseus actually delivers the offer to Achilles, moments later in the very same poem, he recites the full catalogue of gifts in careful and complete detail, tripod by tripod, horse by horse, city by city, and then simply omits that specific condition entirely, never once repeating Agamemnon's demand that Achilles formally submit to his authority as part of accepting the gifts. It is worth pausing on why a careful reader would even notice an omission like this, buried as it is inside a much longer and more dramatic scene. But once you notice it, it is hard to stop seeing its implications, because it tells us that Odysseus, the single most famously clever and most famously persuasive man in the entire Greek army, understood something about this negotiation that Agamemnon himself, sitting back in his own tent, evidently did not. That attaching a demand for formal submission to an offer of restitution would guarantee its rejection before Achilles had even finished hearing the rest of the terms, because submission was precisely the one thing this whole crisis had made structurally impossible for Achilles to grant without confirming, in his own person and in front of the whole watching army, the very devaluation of his own worth that the original theft had already threatened to establish. Odysseus, in other words, appears to have recognized that Agamemnon's own stated terms were, if delivered in full, actually designed to fail, whether Agamemnon consciously intended that failure or not, and quietly edited the message in flight, hoping that the sheer material generosity of the gifts alone, stripped of their attached demand for formal capitulation, might succeed where the full, unedited offer certainly would not have. It did not succeed either, and it is worth sitting with that outcome for a moment, because it tells us that Achilles' objection, whatever role the missing submission clause might or might not have played in his final answer, ran deeper than any single condition attached to the gifts, deep enough that even a version of the offer carefully stripped of its most obviously unacceptable term still could not move him. But it is worth remembering Odysseus's small, quiet edit as we sit with the rest of tonight's story, because it is one of the clearest pieces of evidence the poem gives us that the men around Achilles, even the wisest and most tactically careful among them, understood exactly how fragile and how easily shattered this whole honour economy actually was. Delicate enough that a single accurately reported sentence, honestly relayed from a proud commander to an already wounded subordinate, might have been sufficient all on its own to guarantee the total collapse of the entire negotiation before it had even properly begun. A refusal that could not, in the end, hold itself together. It's worth pausing now on the third envoy's approach, because Ajax, the last of the three men to speak, tries something neither Odysseus nor Phoenix had attempted, and it is worth noticing what actually works, at least partially, where the more elaborate appeals had failed. Ajax does not offer philosophy, and he does not offer an old story carrying an old warning. He offers instead the simplest and most direct appeal available to him, reminding Achilles, in blunt and unadorned terms, that the men he is currently abandoning to slaughter are not abstractions or strangers, but his own comrades, men who have fought and bled and eaten alongside him for 9 long years, men who deserve better, in Ajax's own plain estimation, than to be left to die over a quarrel about a single captive woman, however legitimate the underlying grievance about that woman's treatment actually was. And it is this appeal, more than the elaborate philosophical case Achilles himself had just made, and more than Phoenix's carefully chosen warning, that produces the only real movement in the entire scene, Achilles conceding that he will not yet rejoin the fighting, but that he will also not allow the beached ships themselves to be burned so long as Hector's own assault has not yet reached his personal encampment directly, a concession that offers the desperately embattled Greek army almost nothing in immediate practical terms, and that the 3 envoys, returning to Agamemnon's own tent that same night, have to report, by any honest measure, as a total failure of their mission. It is worth sitting with that partial grudging concession for a moment, because it tells us something important about the actual shape of Achilles' refusal that a simpler telling of this story might smooth over, treating his no as a single, total, unwavering position, held consistently until the death of Patroclus finally breaks it. It was not that simple. Even in the very scene where he delivers his most total and most philosophically radical rejection of the entire war, he is already, quietly, hedging that rejection, drawing a private line beyond which he will not, in fact, allow the consequences of his own protest to run unchecked. And this hedging is worth taking seriously as evidence, rather than dismissing as mere narrative inconsistency, because it suggests that Achilles' refusal was never actually the clean, total position his own rhetoric in front of Odysseus made it sound like. Some part of him, even at the peak of his own fury and his own philosophical doubt about the whole enterprise of glory, remained bound to this army, to these men, to a version of himself that could not, in practice, simply walk away and let his own comrades be annihilated on the beach behind him. And it is worth asking what that partial, unacknowledged loyalty tells us, because it suggests that the identity Achilles had built around the pursuit of undying glory was never quite as separable from ordinary human attachment as his own most radical rhetoric, in the heat of that tent, wanted it to be. This matters enormously to understanding what eventually does bring him back into the war in full, because it was not, in the end, Agamemnon's gifts that accomplished what the whole embassy had failed to accomplish, and it was not, either, some renewed conviction that glory was worth its cost after all, the very doubt he had voiced to Odysseus never actually being answered or refuted anywhere in the poem's own text. It was, instead, the death of Patroclus, his closest companion, killed while wearing Achilles' own armour in a battle Achilles himself had refused to fight. A death that arrived, when we look at it honestly, as a direct and foreseeable consequence of the very refusal we have spent tonight examining, and it is worth pausing on the bitter closed loop this represents, because it means the protest undertaken to defend Achilles' own honour ended up costing him the one thing that mattered to him more than honour ever had, a fact the poem itself seems fully aware of, and that it does not, to its enormous credit, try to soften or explain away. Achilles' return to the fighting, when it finally comes, is not a vindication of the honour system he had originally refused to have violated. It is closer to its total repudiation, because the Achilles who finally picks up a spear again no longer cares, by his own explicit statement, whether he himself lives or dies, no longer cares about the gifts he had once refused, no longer cares, in any meaningful sense, about the very kleos his whole original bargain had been built to secure. He returns not to reclaim his honour, but to answer a grief that has, by this point, entirely swallowed the question of honour whole, and it is worth sitting with the terrible irony of that outcome, because it means the entire elaborate machinery of insult and honour and refusal that occupied nearly the whole of tonight's story turns out, in the end, to have been resolved not by anything the embassy offered, but by a loss that made the original question feel, to the man who had raised it so forcefully, almost entirely beside the point. What Meleager's own city forgot to reckon with, it is worth returning briefly to Phoenix's embedded story about Meleager, because we passed through it quickly earlier tonight in service of a narrower point, and it deserves a second, slower look now, because the parallel between the two heroes runs deeper and stranger than a first pass through the story reveals. Meleager, in Phoenix's telling, had withdrawn from battle after a bitter quarrel with his own mother, who had cursed him, in her own fury over the death of her brothers at his hand, and his city, besieged and desperate without its own greatest defender, sent one delegation after another to win him back. Elders first, then his own father, then his own sisters, then his own dearest friends, each offering escalating rewards for his return, exactly the same rising structure of appeal we watch play out around Achilles in his own tent, and Meleager refused every single one of them, holding his own wounded position long after any reasonable calculation of costs and benefits would have counselled him to relent. It is worth pausing on who finally succeeds where all these official delegations failed, because Phoenix is careful to specify it, and the specificity matters. It was not gifts, and it was not any formal appeal to duty or loyalty delivered by men acting in some official capacity. It was his own wife, coming to him privately, describing to him, in vivid and specific terms, the horrors already beginning to unfold inside the besieged city, and it was that intimate personal appeal, rather than any of the grander and more materially generous overtures that preceded it, that finally moved him to act, though by that point Phoenix tells us with real and pointed emphasis the city's own gratitude had already curdled, and Meleager received none of the rewards that had been promised to him at every earlier stage of the negotiation, saving his own people in the end but gaining nothing at all for himself in the process beyond the simple, unrewarded fact of having done the right thing too late to be thanked for it. It is worth sitting with how precisely this old, embedded story maps onto the crisis unfolding in real time, in the very tent where Phoenix is telling it, and worth noticing too exactly where the map eventually stops matching. Achilles, like Meleager, is being courted by a rising sequence of official delegations offering escalating rewards. Achilles, like Meleager, will eventually be moved, not by any of those official delegations, but by something far more intimate and far more devastating: the death of the one person closest to him, arriving considerably later in this same story, playing structurally the same role that the wife's private appeal plays in Meleager's own tale. And Achilles, like Meleager, will return to the fighting having lost, by the time he finally does return, any chance of receiving the reward that might once have made the whole ordeal feel, in retrospect, worthwhile, because the specific loss that finally moves him will have already made every material reward Agamemnon ever offered feel by comparison almost weightless. But it is worth pausing too on the one crucial place where the two stories diverge, because the divergence is where this whole tradition's honesty about its own most beloved hero actually shows itself most clearly. Meleager's story, as Phoenix tells it, ends in relative safety. A hero who acted too late for his own material benefit, but who nonetheless survives his own long refusal and lives to see his city saved. Achilles' story does not end that way, and Phoenix, telling this cautionary tale in the desperate hope of moving his own former pupil, cannot possibly have known, in that moment, exactly how much darker the actual outcome was going to be for the young man sitting across from him, that the specific loss which would finally break Achilles' own resolve was not going to arrive as some abstract report of a besieged city's suffering, the way it arrived for Meleager, but as the death of the one person in the entire war Achilles had ever allowed himself to love without reservation, a loss that Phoenix's own warning, offered in good faith and with real wisdom, could do nothing at all to prevent, because the warning, however true in its own broader shape, could never have anticipated exactly how personally and exactly how cruelly this particular version of the old story was actually going to play itself out. A king who never came himself. It is worth pausing, before we turn to Briseis and to the wider reception of this whole story, on a small counterfactual question, the kind of question this channel likes to sit with in the quiet hours, because asking it sharpens something important about the actual shape of the failure we have spent tonight examining. Agamemnon, having agreed, under pressure from his own council, to send an embassy bearing gifts and an apology, chose not to go himself. He sent Odysseus, and Ajax and Phoenix, 3 men he trusted and respected, but he remained behind in his own tent, delegating the actual work of reconciliation to intermediaries, rather than walking the length of that same dark beach himself, and delivering the apology in his own person, face to face, with his own voice, to the man he had wronged. It is worth asking what might have been different had he gone himself, because everything we have built across this whole evening about the specific mechanics of a public honour economy suggests that the answer is, quite possibly, a great deal. We established earlier tonight that the wound Achilles suffered was not primarily a material one, and that its severity was measured largely by the fact of its public witness, inflicted in front of the whole assembled army by the one man whose recognition of Achilles' worth actually mattered. It stands to reason, following that same logic all the way through, that the repair of such a wound might have required something closer to an equally public and equally personal act of restitution. The same commander who had inflicted the humiliation walking himself into the tent of the man he had humiliated, in view of anyone who cared to watch, and offering his own apology in his own voice, rather than dispatching a catalogue of gifts through the mouths of other men, however respected and however sincere those other men happened to be. A gift delivered by intermediaries, however generous, still carries within it a small and telling admission that the giver himself was unwilling to bear the personal cost of delivering it, and it is worth wondering whether Achilles, receiving Odysseus's careful and respectful recitation of an offer Agamemnon himself had not troubled to bring in person, understood the absence of the man himself as its own kind of message, a continuation in a gentler key of the very same failure to treat him as an equal worth addressing directly that had caused the original crisis in the first place. This is, admittedly, speculation. The kind of speculation this channel indulges in only carefully, and only when it genuinely illuminates something about the underlying story, rather than simply inventing drama the old poem never intended. But it is worth noting that the poem itself seems to leave room for exactly this reading, choosing, with what looks like real deliberation, to have Agamemnon remain conspicuously absent from the one scene in the whole poem where his own physical presence might actually have mattered most. Kings in this world, we should remember, were not so insulated by ceremony and protocol that a personal visit of this kind would have been unthinkable, and it is worth holding on to the possibility that Agamemnon's absence from his own apology was not a small or incidental detail at all, but one final, quiet demonstration of exactly the pattern Achilles' whole refusal had been protesting from the very beginning. A commander willing to spend his own wealth freely on a problem he still was not willing to spend his own presence on. What it cost Achilles to keep his own hospitality separate from his own fury. It is worth pausing before we turn to the larger single item in Agamemnon's catalogue of gifts, on a small and easy to overlook detail in how Achilles actually receives the 3 envoys who arrive at his tent, because it complicates, in a genuinely useful way, any reading of his refusal that treats him as simply consumed, wall to wall, by an undifferentiated rage. The poem is careful to show us that Achilles, seeing Odysseus, Ajax and Phoenix approaching, does not greet them with hostility or suspicion, despite knowing exactly what mission has brought them to his tent on Agamemnon's own behalf. He rises to meet them, welcomes them warmly, and personally sees to it that wine is mixed and meat is roasted for his guests, extending the full, unhesitating hospitality that this whole ancient world considered a sacred and inviolable obligation owed to any guest arriving in good faith, regardless of what business that guest might be there to conduct. It is worth pausing on how precisely this small domestic scene draws a line that the rest of Achilles' own rhetoric, in the speech that follows, sometimes threatens to blur, a line between his fury at Agamemnon specifically and his relationship with everyone else in the Greek army, a line he maintains here with real and deliberate care even while delivering, moments later, a speech that questions the value of the entire war these same men have spent 9 years fighting. This capacity to distinguish, cleanly and consistently, between the specific target of his own grievance and the innocent men caught in its orbit runs through the whole of this crisis, from his gentle handling of Agamemnon's own heralds when they first arrived to formally claim Briseis, understanding that they bore no personal responsibility for the order they had been sent to carry out, all the way to this later scene of careful, undiminished hospitality toward 3 men delivering an offer he is about to refuse. It is worth sitting with what this careful distinction tells us about the actual shape of Achilles' own moral reasoning throughout this entire crisis, because it suggests something more disciplined and more considered than a man simply overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage, lashing out indiscriminately at everyone within reach. He is angry, specifically and precisely, at Agamemnon, and at the structural failure Agamemnon's own conduct has exposed, and he takes real and repeated care across this whole episode not to let that specific anger contaminate his treatment of men who bear no responsibility for it, a distinction worth holding on to because it will make the later, considerably darker stretch of this same story. Once Patroclus is dead, and Achilles' grief has curdled into something that no longer bothers to draw any such careful lines at all, land with even greater force by contrast. The man capable of mixing wine for his own guests in the very hour of his greatest fury is not, by nature, a man who cannot govern the reach of his own anger. He's a man whose anger, in this particular scene, still knows exactly where its own proper boundary lies, and it is worth remembering that discipline, and its eventual and total collapse later in this same story, as one more thread in the whole complicated portrait tonight, has tried to build of a man considerably more careful and considerably more self-aware than the flattened popular memory of an entitled sulking warrior ever quite gives him credit for being. A daughter offered as the largest gift of all. It is worth pausing before we turn to Briseis on the single largest and strangest item in the whole catalogue of gifts Agamemnon offers, because it tends to pass by quickly in most retellings, folded into the general list of tripods and cauldrons and horses, when in fact it deserves a slower look entirely on its own, since it works according to a rather different logic than everything else on the list. Agamemnon does not simply offer wealth, he offers his own daughter's hand in marriage, with an entire province of 7 wealthy cities attached as her dowry, an offer that would have bound Achilles, formally and permanently, into the royal house of Mycenae itself, transforming a talented but ultimately subordinate commander from a smaller northern kingdom into a son-in-law of the single most powerful king in the entire coalition, with a legitimate claim, through that marriage, on an entire province Achilles had never so much as set foot in. It is worth pausing on what this particular offer was actually trying to accomplish, because it reaches for a different solution than the rest of the catalogue entirely, where the tripods and the cauldrons and the returned captive woman were attempting, in their own limited way, to restore Achilles to the position he had occupied before the theft. The marriage offer was reaching considerably further than restoration, attempting to elevate Achilles permanently above the very structural vulnerability that had made the original insult possible in the first place. A son-in-law of Agamemnon's own house would never again occupy quite the same precarious subordinate position Achilles had occupied at the start of this whole crisis, bound to his commander not merely by an oath sworn years earlier at a different king's wedding, but by blood, by family, by a permanent dynastic tie that no single act of wounded pride on either side could easily undo. It is, examined honestly, a genuinely clever and genuinely generous solution to the underlying structural problem we spent so much of tonight's early argument examining. An attempt not merely to pay Achilles back, but to change, permanently, the very relationship of dependency that had made the original payback necessary at all. And it is worth pausing finally on why even this considerably more sophisticated offer still failed, because the failure tells us something important about just how completely the original insult had already poisoned the well for Achilles. A marriage alliance offered in good faith, before any quarrel had ever occurred, might genuinely have functioned the way it was designed to function, binding 2 proud men together through a tie stronger than any single dispute. But a marriage alliance offered only after the insult, offered specifically as compensation for a wrong already committed, could not entirely escape the shadow of the very transaction it was trying to repair, because Achilles, examining the offer with the same clear and unforgiving eye he had already turned on every other item in the catalogue, could reasonably conclude that even this marriage was being offered to him, not out of genuine familial affection, but as one more instrument, however elaborate, in the same underlying project of managing and controlling him that the original theft of Briseis had already revealed Agamemnon to be engaged in. A bond offered as payment, however permanent in its own legal terms, is never quite the same thing as a bond offered freely, and it is worth sitting with the possibility that Achilles understood this distinction as clearly as he understood the distinction between price and value that occupied so much of the rest of his own speech, refusing not merely the material wealth on offer, but the entire considerably more ambitious project of being permanently absorbed into Agamemnon's own family as a kind of elaborate dynastic consolation prize. A man who could afford to leave, and a man who never could. It is worth pausing before we turn to the mechanics of the failed embassy itself, on a structural contrast the poem sets up, quietly and without much editorial comment, between Achilles and the single greatest warrior on the opposing side, because the contrast illuminates something about Achilles' own refusal that is easy to miss if we only ever examine him in isolation. Hector, the Trojan prince who commands the defence of his own city across the whole of this war, is fighting for reasons that could not be more different, structurally, from the reasons that brought Achilles to this same battlefield, and it is worth sitting with that difference for a moment, because it means the two greatest warriors in the entire poem occupy fundamentally different relationships to the very possibility of refusal that has occupied us for this whole evening. Hector is not a volunteer chasing glory on a foreign shore, the way every single Greek warrior camped on that beach technically is. He is defending his own home, his own wife and infant son, his own aging parents, his own city and everyone inside its walls, from an invading army that has already spent 9 years burning the surrounding countryside and killing or enslaving everyone it could reach. Hector, in other words, has no version of the option Achilles is weighing throughout this whole crisis, no possibility of simply withdrawing from the fighting, sailing home, and resuming an ordinary life elsewhere, because there is no elsewhere for Hector, no second kingdom waiting patiently for his return the way Thea waits for Achilles, no alternative fate his own mother once laid out before him, in which he lives a long life untouched by this particular war. If Hector stops fighting, his city falls, his wife is enslaved, his infant son is killed, and this is not speculation on the poem's own part, since we watch, in the fuller story of this war, exactly this outcome unfold once Hector himself is finally gone. Achilles' refusal, by stark contrast, costs him nothing structurally comparable, at least not in its opening moments, because Achilles retains throughout the entire embassy scene a genuine and repeatedly stated alternative, the long, safe, ordinary life waiting for him at home, an alternative that makes his refusal, whatever its underlying moral seriousness, a genuinely optional stance in a way that nothing available to Hector could ever be. It is worth pausing on what this structural asymmetry tells us about the specific kind of luxury Achilles' whole philosophical crisis actually represents, because a refusal that carries a genuine, viable exit option built into it is simply a different category of act than a refusal that does not, however, sincerely felt either one happens to be. Achilles can afford, in a way Hector never could, to stand in his own tent and seriously entertain the possibility of walking away from this entire war, weighing that possibility with real philosophical seriousness, precisely because walking away remains, for him and for him alone, among the great warriors of this story, genuinely survivable, a live option rather than an abstraction. This is worth holding on to, because it means the entire deeply serious moral argument we've spent tonight reconstructing on Achilles' behalf was only ever available to him because of a structural privilege the poem rarely calls attention to directly. The simple, enormous fact that he had somewhere else to go, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort this produces, a discomfort this channel does not think it would be honest to smooth over, that the single most philosophically serious critique of the entire war's value system in this whole poem was delivered by the one man in it who could most easily afford to abandon that system altogether, while the man defending an actual home with actual irreplaceable people inside it never had the luxury of asking the same question aloud, because for him, unlike for Achilles, the answer had never actually been optional in the first place. a negotiation that failed for reasons a modern mediator would recognise immediately. It is worth pausing, before we turn to Briseis, on how this whole failed embassy would likely be diagnosed by anyone trained in the modern theory and practice of conflict resolution, because it turns out that a great deal of what negotiators and mediators have learned across decades of studying why some disputes settle and others do not, applies to this scene with an accuracy that is almost eerie for a text this old, and looking at the failure through that particular lens helps explain, in slightly different and complementary terms, exactly why an offer this generous still could not close the gap. Modern negotiation theory places enormous weight on a concept usually described as the difference between positions and underlying interests. The observation that what a party says it wants in a dispute, its stated position, is very often not the same thing as what it actually needs in order to feel the dispute has been genuinely resolved, its underlying interest, and that negotiations fail, again and again, when one side responds only to the other's stated position, while never actually addressing the deeper interest driving it. Agamemnon's offer, examined through this lens, responds with real precision to Achilles' stated position, that Briseis and appropriate compensation had been unjustly taken from him, restoring the woman, adding lavish compensation, and going considerably further than the original loss required. What it never addresses, because Agamemnon himself never seems to have understood the distinction, is Achilles' actual underlying interest, which was never simply to be materially compensated, but to have the reliability of the entire system that governed his own worth restored, a system whose reliability, once broken by a unilateral arbitrary seizure, cannot actually be repaired by any subsequent unilateral, if generous, gift, because a second unilateral act, however well-intentioned, only reconfirms the very pattern the first one had already exposed, that Achilles' own standing depends entirely on what Agamemnon chooses to grant him, rather than on anything genuinely secure or guaranteed. It is worth pausing too on a second concept modern mediators reach for constantly, the importance of process alongside outcome, the finding, confirmed across an enormous body of practical experience, that people who feel a decision was imposed on them, however generous its actual terms, tend to resist and resent it far more than people who feel they had a genuine voice in shaping it, even when the final terms are objectively less favourable to them. Achilles was never consulted about the terms of his own restitution. Agamemnon decided unilaterally what would be offered, and dispatched intermediaries to deliver a fixed and non-negotiable package, and it is worth noticing that this is very nearly a textbook description of exactly the kind of process failure modern mediation theory identifies as most likely to produce rejection, regardless of the substantive generosity involved. An offer that replicates, in its own delivery, the very same unilateral top-down exercise of power that had produced the original grievance, so that even a wildly generous package delivered this way risks confirming rather than repairing the underlying breach of trust. It is worth closing this comparison with the one piece of the modern theory that this old scene actually gets right, almost by instinct, and that a great many real modern negotiations fail to get right at all. The recognition, embodied in Nestor's insistence on sending an embassy rather than simply issuing a royal command, that some form of direct respectful engagement, however imperfect, was necessary before the relationship could even begin to be repaired, that a wrong of this magnitude could not simply be resolved by decree from above. The embassy fails in the end, not because this basic instinct was wrong, but because it was not carried far enough, a generous package delivered by trusted intermediaries, rather than a genuine, personal, face-to-face reckoning delivered by the man who had actually caused the harm. And it is worth carrying this diagnosis forward, because it means the failure we have spent so much of tonight examining was never a failure of generosity at all. It was a failure of exactly the kind that any modern student of negotiation, examining the same sequence of events with fresh eyes and 3,000 years of accumulated hindsight, would likely diagnose within minutes. A wound this large requiring not merely payment, but presence. A woman standing at the centre of an argument that was never about her. It would be a genuine dishonesty on a channel that tries to be honest about the uncomfortable parts of these old stories, and not only the parts that flatter their heroes, to spend this much of tonight's story examining Achilles' own interior reasoning without pausing, at real length, on the person whose fate actually triggered the entire crisis, and on how completely absent she is from nearly every argument made about her across this whole extended quarrel. Briseis appears, across the whole of this dispute, almost entirely as an object of contention, rather than as a person with her own voice, her own perspective, her own account of what any of this actually meant to her, and it is worth naming plainly what the poem itself tells us about her life before this quarrel, because it complicates, in a way both men's rhetoric conveniently ignores, the entire premise that this argument was ever really a matter of honour between equals at all. She had already been a married woman before her capture, the wife of a man named Mines, and Achilles himself, in the very raid that carried her off, had killed her husband along with all three of her own brothers, so that the woman, two of the most powerful men in the entire Greek army, are now quarrelling over so bitterly had already lost, in a single afternoon, every man in her own household to the very man now claiming her as his rightful prize, a fact that both Achilles' elaborate speech about honour and Agamemnon's own petulant insistence on his prerogative manage between them never once to mention. It is worth pausing before we go any further on how completely ordinary this specific arrangement, a captured woman distributed as a war prize among the victorious men, actually was across the whole of the ancient world this poem describes, because understanding how unremarkable it was to the poem's own original audience is essential to understanding how radical it is that the poem nonetheless finds room, here and there, to let a small measure of Briseis' own interior life through it all. The taking of captive women as spoils of war was not a practice invented for this particular story, or specific to this particular army. It was, by every account that survives from the wider Bronze Age and early Iron Age world, an entirely standard feature of ancient warfare across the eastern Mediterranean and well beyond it, a practice so deeply woven into the ordinary conduct of a military campaign that neither this poem nor any of the wider tradition surrounding it treats the basic fact of it as requiring justification or explanation of any kind. Cities that fell to a besieging army lost their male defenders to the sword and their surviving women and children to captivity as a matter of unremarkable routine, and the women taken in this way became, in the plainest and most brutal economic sense, property, distributed among the victors according to rank and contribution in exactly the same accounting system that governed the distribution of captured cattle, captured metalwork, and captured grain. It is worth being honest here about what this means for how we ought to read the entire quarrel this whole evening has spent examining, because a modern audience, encountering this story for the first time, can very easily let the poem's own elaborate focus on Achilles' wounded honour obscure just how completely the poem's own moral universe fails to extend anything like the same consideration to Briseis herself. The poem spends thousands of lines examining with real and genuine sophistication exactly what Agamemnon's actions cost Achilles in terms of standing, trust, and meaning. It spends, by comparison, only a small handful of lines allowing us any direct access at all to what those same actions, and the earlier actions that had already made her a captive in the first place, cost the actual woman standing at the centre of the whole dispute. and it is worth naming that imbalance plainly rather than letting the poem's own considerable artistry paper over it, because the imbalance itself tells us something true and worth remembering about whose interior life a warrior culture of this kind was actually built to record, and whose interior life it simply assumed did not need recording at all. It is worth pausing too on the single line, easy to miss amid the surrounding rhetoric about gifts and prizes and wounded pride, in which Achilles himself claims to have loved Briseis, telling Odysseus that he had cherished her from the heart, whatever her formal status as a captured prize of war, a claim that, if we take it seriously rather than reading past it as simple rhetorical flourish, ought to complicate our entire understanding of this quarrel considerably, because it suggests that even within Achilles' own account of events, delivered in the very speech where he is arguing most forcefully that the loss cannot be measured in material terms, there is a genuine human relationship being talked over and instrumentalized in service of an argument about something else entirely, his own wounded standing among other men, rather than being centered as a loss that might matter in its own right, as the loss of an actual person he claims to have cared for. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it exposes one of the genuine limits of the honour economy we have spent so much of tonight examining on its own terms, a system so thoroughly organised around the recognition of men by other men that even a claim of genuine affection for a woman gets folded, almost immediately, back into an argument about a man's own standing among his peers, her own interior experience of any of this, her own grief for a dead husband and 3 dead brothers, her own feelings about the argument 2 powerful men were having over her disposition, left entirely outside the frame both men are operating inside. It is worth noting briefly what happens to her in the aftermath of all this, because the poem does eventually, in a much later scene, give her a small handful of lines of her own, mourning not Achilles' wounded pride but the death of Patroclus specifically, whom she remembers, in her own brief moment of speech, as the one man in this entire camp who had ever spoken kindly to her, who had promised, she tells us, to see her formally married to Achilles once the war was finally won. A small, human detail that arrives almost as an aside in the poem's own account, and that nonetheless does more, in a handful of lines, to restore some genuine interiority to a woman who has spent the entire quarrel functioning as pure occasion for other people's arguments than either Achilles' or Agamemnon's own extended rhetoric ever manages across their considerably longer speeches. It is worth carrying that detail with you as we move towards the close of tonight's story, because it is a useful corrective to the temptation, easy to fall into across an evening spent this deeply inside Achilles' own interior reasoning, to treat this whole crisis purely as a fascinating case study in ancient moral philosophy and forget, in the process, that a real cost was being argued over throughout. A cost measured not only in the wounded pride of powerful men, but in the actual, unconsulted life of a woman who had already lost everything once, before this argument over her disposition even began. A philosopher who wanted his own ideal city to raise its children on gentler stories. It is worth pausing, before we move to the wider sweep of how this scene has been read across the centuries, on one particularly sharp and particularly early piece of criticism this whole episode attracted, because it comes from one of the most influential thinkers the Greek world ever produced, and because his objection cuts directly to the heart of everything we have spent tonight examining. Several centuries after this poem had already become the bedrock of Greek education, recited by schoolboys and quoted by orators and treated, by nearly everyone in the Greek-speaking world, as something close to sacred civic scripture, the philosopher Plato, designing an imaginary ideal city in one of his own most famous works, turned a genuinely critical eye on exactly the kind of heroic behaviour this poem spends so much of its own length celebrating, and found, to his own evident discomfort, a great deal of it unfit for the ears of the young citizens, he hoped his ideal city might one day raise. Plato's objections ran in more than one direction at once, and it is worth naming a few of them here, because they land with real precision directly on the scene we have spent this whole evening examining. He was troubled by heroes who wept and grieved as openly and as extravagantly as Achilles does across this entire story, worried that a city's future guardians, hearing such displays praised and celebrated rather than restrained, might grow up believing that uncontrolled emotional excess was itself a mark of greatness rather than a weakness to be governed by reason. He was troubled too by a hero whose loyalty to his own commander could apparently be purchased or withdrawn on the basis of material gifts, worried that young citizens absorbing this story might come to believe that a man's service to his own community was properly negotiable, a transaction to be haggled over rather than a duty owed unconditionally. And he was troubled, more broadly, by a poetic tradition that seemed, in his own reading of it, to take genuine and unembarrassed delight in depicting a hero dragging a fallen enemy's corpse through the dust in an act of prolonged and vindictive desecration, precisely the behaviour this evening's earlier story has already asked you to sit with honestly rather than smooth over. It is worth pausing on how differently this criticism reads Achilles' whole crisis than the reading we have built across tonight's story, because where we have spent this evening trying to understand Achilles' refusal as a serious and coherent piece of moral reasoning, responding to a genuine structural failure in the honour economy that governed his entire world, Plato reads the very same behaviour as a dangerous model of exactly the kind of unrestrained passion a well-ordered soul, and by extension a well-ordered city, needs to learn to govern rather than indulge. Both readings can be built with real textual support out of the very same scene, and it is worth sitting with that fact rather than trying to resolve it, because it tells us something important about the specific kind of story this actually is, a story detailed and honest enough about the interior workings of human pride and human grief that it can support, with equal textual justification, both a reading that finds real wisdom in Achilles' refusal and a reading that finds in that same refusal a dangerous example of exactly the kind of self-indulgent passion a serious philosophical education ought to be teaching its students to resist. A 20th century reader who saw something closer to a machine. It is worth pausing too on a considerably more recent reading of this same poem, because one of the most influential essays written about the Iliad in the last 100 years came not from a classicist working inside a university, but from a French philosopher and political activist writing in the tense and darkening years just before the outbreak of the Second World War, who read this entire ancient poem as a single, sustained meditation on what she called, in the essay's own title, the poem of force. Her argument, stripped down to its bones, held that force, the raw capacity to end a human life or to strip a human being of their own free will, is the true central character of the entire epic, more central even than any individual hero, and that the poem's real subject is what force does to every single person who comes into sustained contact with it, turning victors into something almost as dehumanized as the victims they defeat, because a man who has learned that he can end another man's existence with a single well-placed spear thrust begins, in her reading, to relate to his own fellow human beings less as fellow persons and more as objects subject to his own will, a transformation this essay traced with real and unflinching precision across nearly every major figure in the poem, Achilles very much included. It is worth pausing on how well this particular reading fits the specific arc we have followed across tonight's story, because it offers a genuinely useful vocabulary for understanding the transformation Achilles undergoes between his own careful, philosophically serious refusal in the embassy scene and the almost inhuman devastation he becomes once Patroclus is dead. A transformation this same essay reads as force working its way, by slow and terrible stages, all the way through a man who had begun the story as its most articulate critic. Achilles, in this reading, spends the embassy scene as one of the poem's clearest moral voices, capable of standing back from the entire machinery of violence and glory and asking, with real seriousness, whether any of it is actually worth what it costs. And Achilles, by the time he finally returns to the battlefield, has been transformed by his own grief into something closer to the very force he had once stood outside of and judged. A man no longer asking whether the war is worth its cost, because he has, by that point, been entirely absorbed into the logic of the war itself, with nothing left standing outside it capable of asking the question anymore. It is worth carrying this reading alongside everything else we've built tonight, not because it settles the argument, since no single reading of a text this old and this contested is ever likely to settle anything permanently, but because it adds one more genuinely serious voice to the long argument this whole evening has been tracing. A reminder that the question of what exactly Achilles' refusal actually meant, and what it cost him to eventually abandon it, has occupied serious and careful readers for every one of the many centuries this poem has continued to be read. 3,000 years of arguing about whether he was right. It is worth closing tonight's investigation with a look at how later generations, inheriting this same scene, chose to argue about it themselves, because the question of whether Achilles was right to refuse and right further to hold that refusal for as long as he did has never actually been settled. Across the whole enormous span of time this story has been read, performed and taught, and it is worth treating that persistent disagreement not as a failure of the text to make its own point clearly, but as evidence of exactly how genuinely difficult the underlying question actually is. Ancient philosophers who studied this poem centuries after it was first composed disagreed sharply among themselves about how to read Achilles' conduct in this entire episode, some treating his refusal as a genuine moral failure, an example of a great man allowing personal pride to override his larger duty to his own comrades, a reading that would eventually feed into a long philosophical tradition suspicious of excessive individual honour-seeking when it threatens collective welfare, and others treating the very same refusal as something closer to the opposite, an admirable, even necessary act of moral clarity, a man refusing to participate in a system that had just demonstrated its own willingness to betray the very promises it claimed to guarantee, a reading that treats Achilles less as a sulking prima donna and more as an early and uncompromising witness against institutional hypocrisy. Both readings can be built with real textual support directly out of the same scene, and it is worth sitting with the fact that a text this old could generate a disagreement this durable, because it suggests the poem itself was never trying to hand its audience a single tidy verdict in the first place. Later dramatists writing for the Athenian stage centuries after the Iliad's own composition returned again and again to figures adjacent to this same crisis, staging plays about Agamemnon's own household, about the broader costs of the whole Trojan expedition, about the specific fates of women like Briseis and Chryseis, whom the original epic had left comparatively voiceless, and it is worth noting that this later tradition, working within a genuinely different set of social assumptions than the warrior aristocracy the Iliad itself depicts, often seems considerably more troubled by the human costs of Achilles' refusal, and of the whole honour economy underlying it, than the original epic quite allows itself to be, a shift in emphasis that tells us something about how differently different ages have needed to hear this same old argument resolved, or left usefully unresolved, depending on what their own particular moment most needed to hear from it. It is worth pausing, too, on how differently this same scene tends to land on audiences encountering it not through the poem itself, but through the various modern retellings, novels and adaptations that have carried this story forward into our own century. Because the specific difficulty we have spent tonight examining, the way Achilles' refusal sits genuinely and deliberately unresolved between moral clarity and self-destructive stubbornness turns out to be one of the hardest things for a modern storyteller to preserve. A number of recent novelistic retellings of this material, working to make Achilles a genuinely sympathetic protagonist for a contemporary readership, have leaned hard into the reading that treats his refusal as fundamentally righteous, a clear-eyed stand against institutional betrayal that the surrounding narrative asks us to simply admire, softening or quietly setting aside the poem's own considerably more uncomfortable insistence that this same righteous stand also gets thousands of his own comrades killed and ultimately costs him the one person he loved most in the world. It is worth naming this tendency not to criticise any particular retelling on its own terms, since every age has always retold this material to suit its own particular needs, exactly the way we discussed a few of the ancient tellings doing the very same thing earlier tonight, but simply to notice that the old poem's own willingness to hold both readings open at once, admiration and genuine moral discomfort together, without collapsing into either one, is a considerably harder balance to strike than it might first appear, and one that a poem composed nearly 3,000 years ago, working with tools far cruder than a modern novel's psychological toolkit, nonetheless managed to strike with a precision that a great many later, more sophisticated retellings have struggled to fully preserve. It is worth pausing too on how thoroughly modern readers of this scene, coming to it out of a world built on formal contracts, independent courts, and codified law rather than an honour economy enforced entirely through public witness, tend to misread the stakes involved almost automatically, reaching instinctively for words like petulant or entitled to describe a man refusing an offer that would strike any modern reader as extraordinarily generous, without first doing the work this whole evening has tried to do, of actually reconstructing the specific, load-bearing role that public honour played in a world with no other reliable mechanism for guaranteeing a man's safety, status, or worth. This channel has found, across many other nights spent in other centuries entirely, that nearly every old story that strikes a modern audience as morally strange on first encounter turns out, on closer inspection, to be operating according to a perfectly coherent internal logic, one that simply assumes a different set of background institutions than the ones we happen to have inherited, and Achilles' refusal, examined this closely, turns out to be one of the clearest examples this whole tradition offers of exactly that pattern. A decision that looks from a sufficient distance like simple pride, and that reveals itself, on close inspection, to be a serious and coherent piece of reasoning about value, trust, and the specific conditions under which a system of honour can still be said to mean anything at all. A control group, the poem hands us almost by accident. It is worth pausing, before we turn to the ordinary soldiers this whole quarrel cost, on a comparison the poem itself sets up without much apparent editorial comment, because it functions, whether the original poet intended it this precisely or not, almost like a natural experiment, offering us a second case of exactly the same underlying problem, resolved through a different mechanism entirely, and the contrast is worth sitting with because it clarifies, by comparison, exactly what Achilles lacked. Chryses, the elderly priest whose own daughter had been taken as a prize by Agamemnon in the very same round of raiding that produced Briseis, suffered, in miniature, precisely the same wrong Achilles was about to suffer. A man publicly and humiliatingly refused when he came in good faith to redeem his own child, sent away from the Greek camp with threats rather than the respectful hearing his age and his priestly office should have guaranteed him. It is worth pausing on how Chryses' own version of this crisis actually gets resolved, because unlike Achilles, he had no army of his own, no formal standing within the Greek coalition, no sword he could plausibly draw against the man who had wronged him. What he had, instead, was a direct line to a god, and it is worth noticing that this single asymmetry changed everything about how quickly and how completely his own grievance was addressed. Apollo, hearing his priest's prayer, did not negotiate, did not send an embassy bearing gifts, did not weigh the political costs of embarrassing Agamemnon in front of his own council. He simply began killing, methodically and without warning, the mules and the dogs and then the soldiers of the entire Greek camp, until the wrong was corrected, immediately and without any further discussion required. Chryseis was returned within days of the plague's onset, no negotiation necessary because the party enforcing the correction held a form of power that made negotiation entirely beside the point. It is worth pausing on what this comparison actually tells us about Achilles' own, considerably slower and considerably more contested path toward the very same kind of correction. Because Achilles, lacking Chryseis' direct access to an angry god, willing to act immediately and unilaterally on his behalf, had to settle for something structurally similar but considerably more indirect and considerably more costly to obtain, appealing to his own mother, a goddess in her own right, to intercede with Zeus and secure, through the much slower machinery of battlefield reversal rather than plague, the same basic outcome, a demonstration to the whole Greek army of exactly how much it needed the man it had wronged. It is worth noticing that both mechanisms, Apollo's plague and Zeus's battlefield favour toward Troy, ultimately achieve the same underlying goal, forcing an entire army to suffer collective consequences until a single individual wrong is finally corrected, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort this produces, because it means the poem itself, examined this closely, seems to accept, almost without comment, that the only mechanisms genuinely capable of enforcing this kind of correction, whether wielded by an aggrieved priest or an aggrieved warrior, operate by making an entire community suffer until it fixes what one individual within it had broken. A genuinely unsettling feature of the whole moral universe this poem describes, and one worth naming plainly rather than letting it pass by unremarked, simply because the poem itself treats it as an unremarkable feature of how justice, in this particular world, actually gets done. The men whose names the whole quarrel never bothered to learn. It is worth pausing, before we move toward tonight's close, on a category of casualty this whole evening's investigation has, until now, left almost entirely to one side, because we have spent a great deal of careful attention on Achilles and a fair measure of it on Agamemnon, and a shorter but still deliberate stretch of it on Briseis, and it would be a genuine failure of this channel's own stated habits to close tonight's story without at least naming plainly the largest group of people this whole quarrel actually cost, the ordinary Greek soldiers who died in the days and weeks that Achilles' withdrawal dragged on, men whose own names the poem, for the most part, simply does not record. It is worth pausing on how the old poem itself handles these deaths, because it is honest, in its own way, about the sheer scale of the dying, describing the funeral pyres burning continuously along the beach, the ranks of the Greek army visibly thinning as the Trojan advance presses closer and closer to the ships. But it is also, and this is worth naming plainly, considerably more interested in the small number of named aristocratic casualties whose individual deaths the poem can turn into a moment of real dramatic weight. A captain here, a lesser king there, each one given a few lines of biography before his death, a father's name, a home city, sometimes a wife or a child left behind, while the great mass of ordinary spearmen and archers who died in the same fighting pass through the poem's own account largely as a collective noun, the army, the ranks, the ships, rather than as individuals whose own particular fear and whose own particular grief might have deserved the same careful attention the poem lavishes so generously on its named heroes. This is not, it should be said plainly, a flaw unique to this particular poem. It is, this channel has found across a great many other long nights spent, with a great many other old stories, one of the most consistent patterns in the whole of recorded history. The tendency of any surviving account, whether epic poem or royal chronicle or colonial ledger, to preserve the names and the motives of the powerful in loving detail, while letting the ordinary dead pass by as a rounding error, a body count rather than a roll call. We have met this same pattern before, on other nights in this room, watching a mountain of silver in the Andes swallow the names of thousands of native miners while carefully recording to the last coin the wealth their labour produced, and it is worth naming the pattern again here, because Achilles' quarrel, examined this closely, offers one of the oldest and clearest examples this whole tradition has to give us, a war whose most philosophically serious speeches are given entirely to two proud and powerful men arguing over a woman and a principle, while the actual arithmetic of who dies to give that argument its stakes is left almost entirely off the page, felt only in the poem's own passing mentions of burning pyres and thinning ranks, never once counted out by name the way Agamemnon's tripods and cauldrons are counted out by number. It is worth sitting with this asymmetry for a moment before we move on, because it complicates, in a useful way, any reading of this whole story that treats Achilles' refusal as purely and simply an act of principled resistance against institutional betrayal, admirable in every respect. His resistance was, by any honest accounting, considerably easier for him to sustain than it was for the men who bore its actual immediate cost, the ordinary soldiers who had no stake whatsoever in the argument over Briseis, no voice in the negotiations conducted in Achilles' own tent, and no choice at all about whether to keep fighting and dying, while two much more powerful men worked out, at their own leisurely pace, exactly how the terms of an apology ought to be structured. It is worth remembering, as this whole evening draws toward its own close, that even the most philosophically serious and most genuinely justified act of individual protest can still, when the protester holds a position of sufficient power and sufficient irreplaceability, end up distributing its costs almost entirely onto people who had no say in the protest at all. A pattern that, once you have learned to see it here, in a poem nearly 3,000 years old, becomes very difficult to stop noticing in a great many other stories besides. What it actually took to become the greatest warrior of a generation, and why that making matters here. It is worth pausing in these last stretches of tonight's investigation on something we have taken almost entirely for granted across this whole evening, the sheer uncontested fact of Achilles' own irreplaceability, because that fact did not simply exist as a given feature of the world this poem describes. It was built, deliberately and over years, by people who invested real time and real care into shaping this one particular boy into something the rest of the army could not do without. And it is worth pausing on that formation now, because it clarifies why the theft of Briseis, registered as such a uniquely intolerable violation to Achilles specifically, among all the many proud warriors gathered on that same beach. This channel has told, on another night entirely, the fuller story of Achilles' own upbringing, sent away as a boy to the mountains of Thessaly to be raised by the wise centaur Chiron, tutored in medicine, in music, and in the particular, deliberately cultivated ferocity that made him what he eventually became. And it is worth summarising that formation briefly here, not to retell it in full, but to remind ourselves what actually stood behind the poem's own casual, repeated insistence that Achilles was simply, uncomplicatedly the best fighter in the entire Greek army. That superiority was not incidental to him, a talent he happened to be born with, and could set aside without consequence the way a man might set aside a hobby. It was the entire, deliberately constructed purpose of his own upbringing, years of specialised training aimed at producing exactly the kind of warrior no other kingdom in the whole Greek world could match. And it is worth understanding that a life invested this heavily, this early, and this deliberately in a single, narrow form of excellence leaves considerably less room for a person to draw their own sense of worth from anywhere else. It is worth pausing too on how this specific kind of formation compounds everything else we've built tonight about the fragility of Achilles' own position, once his honour was publicly violated. A man whose entire childhood and adolescence had been organised around becoming an unmatched instrument of battlefield glory, at the direct and considerable cost of the ordinary, broader development an ordinary boy might otherwise have received, arrives at adulthood with a correspondingly narrower set of resources for weathering a wound to that one, carefully cultivated identity. He was not simply a talented soldier among many other talents he might have fallen back upon. He was, by the deliberate design of his own upbringing, almost entirely defined by this one specific excellence, and it is worth sitting with the possibility that this narrowness of formation, quite apart from anything about the specific bargain of glory for a short life that we examined earlier tonight, made him considerably more vulnerable, rather than less, to a wound that struck directly at the one domain his entire life had been built around. A man with a wider range of sources for his own sense of worth might have absorbed Agamemnon's insult as a serious but survivable blow to one part of a larger, more distributed identity. Achilles, raised from boyhood to be nothing other than the greatest warrior of his own generation, had no such wider range to fall back on, and it is worth carrying that observation forward as one final layer in the whole architecture of vulnerability this evening has been slowly constructing around a single, furious refusal in a tent on a beach nearly 3,000 years ago. A wound that modern military psychology finally learned to give a name. It is worth pausing before we ask why this old story still finds its way into a quiet bedroom 3,000 years later, on a considerably more recent piece of vocabulary, because researchers studying the psychological aftermath of modern warfare have, in the last few decades, developed a specific term for a specific kind of wound that turns out to describe Achilles' own crisis with an accuracy that is worth sitting with carefully before we close tonight's story. That term is moral injury, and it was developed in large part to describe something that clinicians working with combat veterans kept encountering that did not quite fit the existing clinical picture of trauma built around fear and physical danger alone. A distinct and often more corrosive wound produced not by what a soldier had feared or suffered, but by a betrayal of what that soldier had believed to be a fundamental, trustworthy moral order, most severely when the betrayal came from a legitimate authority the soldier had trusted and served in good faith. It is worth pausing on how precisely this modern clinical description maps onto everything we have spent tonight examining, because moral injury, as researchers have come to understand it, does not typically arise from an enemy's violence, which a soldier expects and is psychologically prepared for from the outset, but from the much more disorienting discovery that one's own side, one's own command structure, the very system a soldier had risked everything to serve faithfully, could act in a way that violated the soldier's own deepest sense of what that service was supposed to mean, and what it was supposed to be owed in return. This is examined with the vocabulary tonight's whole investigation has been slowly building. An almost exact clinical description of what happened to Achilles in that assembly. A wound inflicted not by any Trojan spear, which he had faced without hesitation for 9 long years, but by his own supreme commander, the man whose authority he had served faithfully across that entire span, acting in a way that shattered his own fundamental trust in the very system his whole chosen life had been staked upon. It is worth pausing too on what researchers studying moral injury have found about how this particular kind of wound behaves differently from ordinary fear-based trauma, because the finding illuminates something about why Achilles' own reaction took the specific sustained shape it did, rather than simply fading with time the way an ordinary insult might. Moral injury, unlike simple fear, does not respond well to reassurance or to compensation offered after the fact, because the wound is not primarily about danger avoided or safety restored. It is about meaning, about whether the entire framework of purpose and sacrifice a person has organised their life around can still be trusted to hold, and clinicians have found that this particular kind of wound often requires something considerably harder to obtain than an apology or a payment, a genuine sustained process of moral repair that acknowledges the full weight of what was actually violated, rather than a transactional settlement that treats the wound as though it was simply a material loss awaiting simple compensation. It is worth carrying this modern clinical vocabulary alongside everything we built earlier tonight about price and value, because it confirms from an entirely different direction and an entirely different century exactly the same underlying diagnosis Achilles himself reached, standing furious and grieving in his own tent nearly 3,000 years before anyone had a formal name for what had actually happened to him. That some wounds simply are not the kind of thing a payment, however generous, was ever built to reach. Why a labour dispute on a Bronze Age beach still finds its way into a dark bedroom 3,000 years later. It is worth pausing in these last stretches before tonight's story closes on a question this channel likes to ask itself quietly, in the background, across nearly every long night we spend together, because it is worth asking directly for once rather than simply trusting that the answer will take care of itself. Why does any of this still matter to you, lying wherever you are lying right now in a world separated from Achilles' own tent by roughly 3,000 years, by an ocean or two, by languages his own poets never dreamed would exist, by an entire civilization's worth of accumulated change in how human beings organize their lives, their wars, and their own sense of what a person is actually owed? It would be easy enough to answer that question with something vague about the timelessness of great literature, and there is truth in that. But it is worth reaching for something a little more specific and a little more honest than that, here at the very end. I think the reason a quarrel this old, this specific, and this apparently narrow, one man's stolen prize, one commander's wounded pride, one refusal held for the length of a few desperate weeks, still finds its way into a quiet bedroom on the other side of the world, and the other side of history is that the actual underlying question Achilles was wrestling with in that tent has never once, in all the centuries since, actually been resolved, only recostumed. Every single one of us, in ways considerably smaller and less mythic than a war fought over a strait in Asia Minor, has stood at some point in our own life in a version of that same tent, having given something, effort, loyalty, years, love, in good faith, to some person or some institution that we trusted to recognise what we had given and to honour it in return, and having discovered at some point that the recognition we believed we had been promised could be withdrawn or diminished or simply overridden by someone with more power than we had, for reasons that had very little to do with the actual value of what we had contributed. Most of us do not respond to that discovery with a threatened murder in front of an assembled army, and most of us, mercifully, are not offered, in the aftermath, a king's daughter and 7 cities as an attempted apology. But the underlying shape of the wound, the discovery that the system we trusted to translate our own effort into recognised worth was never actually as reliable as we needed it to be, is a wound nearly every listener to this channel has felt in some form, in a marriage, in a career, in a friendship, in a family. And it is worth naming here at the close that this is very likely the real and durable reason this particular ancient argument has never actually gone quiet, because it was never really an argument about a war at all. It was an argument about what happens to a person who discovers, too late to undo the discovery, that they had bet everything on a promise nobody could actually guarantee. It is worth sitting too with the fact that this channel has no tidy resolution to offer you for that same feeling, wherever it happens to live in your own life tonight, because Achilles himself never found one either. Not really. Not in any form a modern audience would recognise as closure. He found instead a considerably worse loss that made the original one feel almost beside the point, and a return to the fighting that answered his grief but never actually answered the philosophical question his own refusal had raised, and a death waiting for him not long after, that the whole story has always known was coming from its very first page. There is no lesson at the end of tonight's story shaped like a clean moral. Take this specific action, and the wound will heal. There is only, I think, the considerably quieter and considerably more durable comfort of knowing that this particular ache, the ache of having given something real to a system that turned out not to be as trustworthy as it claimed to be, is old enough and human enough and universal enough that a poet working in a language dead for 2,500 years already understood it well enough to build the single most enduring poem in the whole of Western literature directly on top of it, and it is worth letting that recognition sit with you now in these last few minutes, the way this channel likes to let its hardest recognitions sit, quietly, without forcing them into a shape they were never actually going to take. A question the poem never thinks to ask, and that is worth asking anyway. It is worth pausing, in these final stretches before tonight's story closes, on a thought experiment this channel does not usually indulge in, because it involves imagining a version of events the poem itself never considers even as a remote possibility. And it is worth trying anyway, briefly, because the exercise sharpens something important about the limits of everything we have spent this whole evening examining. What would this entire crisis have looked like if Briseis herself had been asked, at any point across its whole unfolding, what she actually wanted, whether she wished to remain in Achilles' own tent, to be returned to whatever remained of her own devastated homeland, or to be granted some third outcome neither man arguing over her ever thought to imagine on her behalf? It is worth sitting with how completely unthinkable this question would have been to every single participant in this entire crisis. Achilles and Agamemnon and Odysseus and Nestor and Phoenix and Ajax alike, because the honour economy we have spent this whole evening reconstructing so carefully, with its elaborate attention to public witness and reciprocal obligation, and the precise, careful accounting of prizes distributed among deserving men, simply had no category, none whatsoever, for asking a captive woman what she herself might want, because her own preferences, within the entire framework this poem describes, were never treated as a variable that any of the actual decision-makers needed to consider at all. It is worth naming plainly that this is not a minor gap in an otherwise admirable system. It is a foundational limitation built into the very structure of the honour economy itself, a system so thoroughly organised around the recognition of free propertied men that an entire class of people, the captured women who were themselves the objects being fought over in dispute after dispute across this whole tradition, existed permanently and completely outside its own capacity to extend recognition, dignity, or voice. It is worth carrying this thought experiment forward, not because it changes anything about the actual events the poem describes, since the poem was composed within and for a world that genuinely could not imagine the question we have just asked, but because it is worth reminding ourselves, here at the very close of tonight's long investigation, that even the most philosophically serious and most carefully reasoned system of value, this poem constructs, the elaborate architecture of time and Giras and Eidos we have spent this whole evening admiring for its own internal coherence, was still, in the end, a system built by men, for men, measuring what men owed to other men, and that its considerable sophistication in that narrow domain should never be mistaken for a comprehensive account of what justice, examined in full, might actually have required. It is worth letting that limitation sit alongside everything else we have learned tonight, a reminder that even the oldest and most carefully constructed moral architectures human beings have ever built can achieve real and admirable internal consistency while still leaving out, entirely and without apparent awareness of the omission, an entire category of people whose own worth the system was never designed to measure at all. A problem that never actually went away. It is worth pausing in these final stretches of tonight's story on how directly the specific philosophical distinction Achilles reaches for in his own tent, the distinction between what a thing costs and what a thing is genuinely worth, continues to occupy serious thinkers wrestling with questions that have nothing to do with ancient Greece at all. Modern moral philosophy has developed its own considerable body of work around what some thinkers call incommensurable values, goods that cannot be measured against one another on any single common scale, however much a market economy or a legal system might insist, for its own practical convenience, on assigning them one anyway. Courts asked to calculate financial damages for the loss of a human life. Insurers asked to price the destruction of an irreplaceable natural landscape. Families asked to accept a settlement in exchange for the wrongful death of someone they loved, all confront in their own modern and bureaucratic idiom some version of the exact gap Achilles identified in that tent on the beach nearly 3,000 years earlier, the gap between a number that can be written on a cheque and a loss that no number, however large, actually addresses. The specific vocabulary changes across the centuries, Kleos and Geras giving way to settlements and damages and compensation packages, but the underlying structure of the problem, a wrong that a society's available mechanisms of repair were never actually built to reach, remains recognisably the same. It is worth noticing, too, that Achilles' own resolution to this problem, or rather his own refusal to accept any resolution at all, remains one of the more honest responses available to anyone caught inside this same structural gap. More honest, certainly, than the alternative of simply accepting the payment and pretending to himself and to everyone watching that the payment had actually made him whole. There is a kind of dignity, however costly, in a man who looks at an offered settlement and says plainly that it does not touch what was actually broken, rather than accepting the settlement and performing a gratitude he does not actually feel. And it is worth sitting with the possibility that Achilles' refusal, whatever catastrophic consequences it eventually produced, at least had the considerable virtue of being entirely honest about the true size of the gap between the wrong done to him and the wealth being offered to cover it, a honesty that a great many people faced with analogous situations across every subsequent century of human history have found themselves unable, for all kinds of understandable practical reasons, to actually afford. It is worth pausing before we let this whole long investigation finally come to rest, on how differently tonight's version of this story sits against the shorthand most people carry around in their heads for it. Because if you asked 100 people who happen to remember anything at all about Achilles and Agamemnon's quarrel, why the war's greatest warrior briefly stopped fighting, a great many of them would answer, without much hesitation, that he was sulking over a woman. A flattened, dismissive summary that treats an entire evening's worth of genuine moral and philosophical seriousness as though it amounted to nothing more than wounded vanity. It is worth naming here at the close exactly how much that popular shorthand actually loses, because we have spent this whole night together demonstrating piece by piece that the refusal was never simply about a woman, was never simply about vanity, and was never in the end even simply about honour. in the narrow sense the word usually carries in casual conversation. It was about whether a promise, once broken by the very authority responsible for keeping it, can ever actually be trusted again by any quantity of subsequent generosity, a question every serious person eventually has to answer for themselves, at least once in the course of an ordinary human life. And it is worth carrying the fuller, harder version of this story forward with you now, rather than the flattened one, the next time you hear this scene mentioned in passing, and feel the old, easy shorthand rising up to explain it away. And it is worth closing, finally, on the particular tragedy embedded in the fact that Achilles turned out, in the end, to be at least partly right, and that being right did not save him, or anyone he loved, from the consequences of the whole affair regardless. The honour economy he had staked his entire chosen life upon really was as fragile and as arbitrarily enforceable as his refusal accused it of being, a system capable of being violated at will by whoever happened to hold the most power on any given day, exactly as he had argued to Odysseus in that tent, and the gifts really could not buy back what had actually been damaged, exactly as he had insisted, because the damage was never located in the specific material loss at all. But being correct about the fragility of the system he had built his life around did not spare him the cost of that fragility, because the war went on regardless of who was right about its underlying value, and his own withdrawal from it, however philosophically justified, produced consequences that eventually reached past Agamemnon entirely, and struck the one person in the whole story Achilles had never staked any argument on, the one person whose loss no philosophical case about price and value had ever prepared him to survive. It is worth sitting, too, with what this whole investigation ultimately suggests about the specific, narrow difference between a protest that succeeds and a protest that becomes a tragedy, because the two are not always as far apart as we might like to believe, and Achilles' own case sits, uncomfortably, very close to the dividing line between them. His diagnosis of the broken system was accurate. His refusal to accept a repair that did not actually address the underlying breach was, by every standard of moral reasoning this evening has tried to construct in his defence, genuinely serious and genuinely justified, and yet the specific form his protest took, a withdrawal of service from a coalition that could not survive without him, converted a private grievance into a public catastrophe whose costs fell overwhelmingly on people who had no part in causing it. And it is worth admitting, honestly, that we do not actually know, even after this whole long evening of careful reconstruction, whether a different, less totalizing form of protest might have achieved the same vindication of principle without paying quite so catastrophic a price for it. The poem itself does not know either, and it is worth trusting that uncertainty rather than forcing it into a tidier shape than the actual evidence supports, because a story this old and this carefully constructed, still capable of provoking this much genuine, unresolved argument after nearly 3,000 years, has almost certainly earned the right to leave its hardest question sitting exactly where it left it, unanswered, for every subsequent listener to weigh for themselves. It is worth sitting with that, in these last quiet minutes before we close tonight's story, the way this channel likes to sit with the hardest parts of any story before letting you go, because it is, I think, the truest and the saddest thing this whole long investigation actually has to tell us, that a man can look clearly and correctly at the broken promise underneath his own entire way of life, can refuse it with real courage and real philosophical seriousness, and can still, in the end, find that the cost of being right was never going to be paid by the people who broke the promise in the first place, but by the people standing closest to him when the whole fragile structure finally gave way. That is not a comfortable place to leave a story, and this channel has never promised you comfortable endings, only honest ones, and it is worth letting this particular honesty settle over you now, quietly, the way the dark settles over a room once the last light has finally been turned off, because there is a strange, real peace available, even in an ending this unresolved. The peace of finally understanding, in full, exactly why an old quarrel over a woman and a handful of tripods turned out to matter enough to still be worth telling, carefully and at length, on a night 3,000 years and half a world away from the beach where it actually happened. Sleep well, and I will see you again on another night, somewhere further along this same long unfinished argument about what a life, or a war, or a single stolen woman's freedom is actually worth.